7, 8, 9, 10. A machine here. There you go. Nobody works like David in this house.
Welcome, friend. Settle yourself comfortably into your pillows. Adjust your blankets, just so, and let your breathing slow to a gentle, peaceful rhythm. Tonight, we embark on a journey through the hidden histories and forgotten tales of one of the arena's most fascinating warriors. Close your eyes if you wish, or let them drift half open in that pleasant space between waking and dreaming. The story we're about to explore is one of precision, of mastery, of a small green creature who discovered that sometimes the quietest warriors leave the deepest marks. This is the story of the Dart Goblin Dot in the vast and chaotic world of Clash Royale, where giants shake the earth with every footstep, where wizards hurl bolts of arcane energy, where dragons breathe fire across entire battlefields. There exists a humble figure who has carved out his own legendary status through means far more subtle. He doesn't tower over his enemies. He doesn't announce his presence with thunderous roars or explosive spells. Instead, he stands at a distance, barely larger than the grass beneath his feet, and with methodical precision. He sends dart after dart whistling through the air with deadly accuracy. The Dart Goblin measures just over 2 feet tall when standing at his full height, though he rarely stands still for long. His skin carries that distinctive goblin green, a shade that seems to absorb and reflect the arena's light in equal measure, making him blend with foliage one moment and stand out starkly the next. But it's not his stature that captures the eye, not his size that commands respect from seasoned warriors and strategists alike. It's what he wears and what he carries that tells his true story. Upon his face rests a voodoo mask, carved from wood that has been hardened through processes known only to the deepest goblin traditions. The mask's eyes glow with an inner light, red as embers in the darkness, peering out from carved sockets that have witnessed countless battles. The mask isn't merely decoration or protection. It's a statement, a connection to powers and knowledge that most goblins never access. Behind the mask, rope and leaves dangle in team colors, swaying with every movement, marking him as a warrior who's chosen his allegiance while maintaining his connection to more ancient loyalties. His face paint, applied with careful ritual each morning before battle, bears the colors of his team. Whether blue or red, the paint is never haphazard, never casual. Each stroke follows patterns that have meaning, that tell stories to those who know how to read them. The paint speaks of victories earned, of skills mastered, of a journey from novice to expert that was neither quick nor easy. And then there's his weapon, the blowgun he cradles with the same reverence that a knight might show his sword, the same care that a wizard lavishes on his staff. It's not a complex device, this blowgun. It's bamboo, hollowed and smoothed, lighter than it looks, but sturdy enough to have survived countless deployments into the heat of arena combat. The simplicity of the weapon is deceptive, though. In the hands of someone who hasn't spent years mastering its use, a blowgun is nearly useless. In the hands of the Dart Goblin, it becomes an instrument of precision warfare, capable of striking targets at ranges that leave most opponents baffled and frustrated. The darts themselves are small, almost delicate things, each one carefully balanced, each tip treated with compounds that make even glancing blows meaningful. He carries these darts in a quiver fashioned from materials he's gathered across years of service, each one checked before battle, each one selected with the kind of attention that master craftsmen give to their finest work. This attention to detail, this obsessive care for his equipment and his craft, defines everything the Dart Goblin is and everything he has become. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To truly understand the Dart Goblin, to appreciate how a small green creature armed with a bamboo tube and tiny projectiles became one of the most respected and feared units in the entire Clash Royale arena, we need to go back. We need to understand not just who he is, but where he came from. we need to explore the deep history of goblin kind. The traditions and secrets that flow through his veins, like the very blood that keeps him moving, keeps him fighting, keeps him standing at impossible ranges, and delivering death through whispers of air and tiny point tips. The story of the Dart Goblin is intimately connected to the story of all goblins. Those small, mischievous, often underestimated creatures who have populated human folklore for centuries. It's connected to the development of goblin warfare, to the ways these diminutive beings learn to survive and thrive in a world filled with creatures much larger and ostensibly much more powerful. It's a story of specialization, of finding your niche and mastering it so completely that you become irreplaceable, invaluable, legendary in your own right. The Dart Goblin arrived in the Clash Royale arena on January 13th, 2017. That date marks his official introduction to the game. The moment when players first had access to this 3 elixir rare card. Unlockable from the jungle arena. But his story, his true story, begins long before that date. It begins in the misty depths of goblin history, in the traditions and knowledge passed down through countless generations. In the moment when one particular goblin looked at a blowgun and saw not just a hunting tool or a toy, but a weapon capable of changing the very nature of arena combat. Tonight, we'll walk through that history together. We'll explore how the Dart Goblin came to be, not just as a game card with statistics and abilities, but as a character, a personality, a warrior with his own motivations and dreams and understanding of the world. We'll examine his relationships with other goblins, his place in the broader goblin society, the respect he commands, and the jealousy he sometimes inspires. We'll delve into the technical aspects of his craft, understanding what makes a master blowgun specialist, and how one achieves such precision at such remarkable ranges. We'll trace his journey through the meta, watching his strategies evolved around him as players discovered optimal ways to deploy him, as balance changes adjusted his power level while maintaining his core identity. We'll witness his transformation into his evolved form, that moment when he stumbled upon ancient secrets in a goblin temple deep underground, finding a poisonous mask that would amplify his already formidable abilities into something even more devastating. And through it all, we'll maintain that gentle, relaxed pace. There's no rush in storytelling, no urgency that can't wait until morning. The Dart Goblin's tale has waited years to be told in full. It can wait a few more hours as we explore every detail, every nuance, every small moment that contributed to making him who he is today. Let your mind drift along with the narrative, following wherever it leads, allowing the images and ideas to form naturally in that space where conscious thought begins to blur into dream. The arena is vast, filled with countless warriors, each with their own stories, their own journeys, their own moments of triumph and defeat. But tonight, this night, we focus on one small figure standing at the back line, taking careful aim through his bamboo tube, releasing a dart that will fly true across impossible distances to strike exactly where he intended. Tonight, we honor the patience, the precision, the quiet mastery of the Dart Goblin dot, so breathe deeply. Let your muscles relax, starting from your toes and working upward, releasing all the tension of the day. Feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort, into that peaceful state where stories can be received fully, where imagination can paint pictures more vivid than any screen could show. The Dart Goblin is ready to share his secrets. The question is whether you're ready to listen, to learn, to understand what it means to be small in a world of giants, yet leave a mark that cannot be ignored or forgotten. The moon rises over the arena. Shadows lengthen and merge. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, a small green figure checks his equipment one more time, ensuring everything is perfect, everything is ready. Because that's what masters do. That's what the Dart Goblin has always done. And that's where our story truly begins. The ancient origins of goblin kind. To understand the Dart Goblin, we must first understand goblins. Not the cartoonish caricatures or simplified game pieces, but the rich, complex creatures whose folklore stretches back through centuries of human storytelling, whose characteristics and natures vary wildly depending on which culture's tales you examine, whose very existence seems to occupy that liminal space between the mundane and the magical, the physical and the metaphysical. Goblins first appear in the stories of medieval Europe, though their origins likely stretch back even further into the oral traditions that preceded written records. The word itself carries weight and history, evolving through languages and cultures, picking up new meanings and associations with each retelling. In some tales, goblins are household spirits, mischievous but not necessarily malevolent, playing tricks on humans but also sometimes helping with chores if properly appeased with offerings of food or drink. In other stories, they're grotesque monsters dwelling in caves and dark places, stealing children and hoarding treasure, creatures to be feared and avoided rather than merely tolerated. The appearance of goblins varies tremendously across different cultural traditions. Some describe them as small and wizened, resembling diminutive old men with long noses and pointed ears. Others paint them as more monstrous, with green or gray skin, sharp teeth, and eyes that gleam with unsettling intelligence. Some traditions grant them magical abilities, shape-shifting, or illusion, or the power to curse those who cross them. Others portray them as purely physical beings, clever and cunning, but bound by the same natural laws that govern all creatures. What remains consistent across most goblin folklore is their association with cunningness, their tendency toward mischief, and their outsider status. Goblins exist at the edges of human society, never fully part of it, but never completely separate from it either. They're the explanation for missing objects, for crops that fail without apparent reason, for the vague sense of unease that settles over certain places. They represent chaos constrained, danger that can be managed but never fully eliminated. The reminder that not everything in the world operates according to human rules and expectations. In the Clash universe, goblins inherit aspects of all these traditions while forging their own distinct identity. They're small, yes, standing barely over 2 feet tall even in their most impressive specimens. Their skin carries that distinctive green hue, ranging from pale, almost yellow-green to deep emerald, depending on the individual. Their ears are pointed, their eyes large and expressive, capable of conveying surprising depth of emotion despite their non-human features. They move with a peculiar combination of clumsiness and grace, seeming to stumble and scramble while actually maintaining perfect control of their movements. Goblin society in the Clash world is complex and often misunderstood by the larger creatures who share their battlefields. To most observers, goblins appear to be simple, almost primitive beings driven by basic impulses and lacking the sophisticated social structures of kingdoms and courts. This perception is deeply, fundamentally wrong. Goblin society is ancient, with traditions and hierarchies that have been refined over countless generations. What appears as chaos to outsiders is actually carefully maintained social order, with rules and expectations that every goblin understands from birth. The goblin community is built around clans, extended family groups that often specialize in particular skills or roles. Some clans focus on construction and engineering, producing the barrels, cages, and machines that feature so prominently in goblin warfare. Others specialize in demolition, mastering the use of explosives and understanding structural weaknesses with intuitive genius. Still others dedicate themselves to combat, developing fighting techniques that maximize the advantages of small size and surprising speed. Within each clan, young goblins are educated in both general knowledge and specialized skills. The education is informal by human standards, lacking structured classrooms or formal curricula. Instead, knowledge passes from elder to youth through demonstration, practice, and stories told around evening fires. Young goblins learn by watching, by attempting and failing and trying again, by absorbing the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors through methods that seem casual but are actually remarkably effective. Goblin warfare represents a fascinating study in asymmetric combat. Goblins recognized early that they would never match the raw strength of barbarians, the armored protection of knights, the magical power of wizards. Rather than seeing this as an insurmountable disadvantage, they turned it into opportunity. They developed fighting styles that emphasize speed over strength, numbers over individual power, cleverness over direct confrontation. They became masters of overwhelming enemies through coordinated group attacks, of exploiting weaknesses, of striking from unexpected angles and retreating before effective counterattacks could be mounted. But within this general goblin approach to warfare, specializations developed. Some goblins favored close combat, wielding knives and daggers with surprising skill, darting in to strike vulnerable points before enemies could bring their superior reach to bear. Others preferred thrown weapons, hurling spears from relative safety, contributing to battles without exposing themselves to the terrible danger of melee combat. And a very select few, turned to projectile weapons that required years of training to use effectively, but offered advantages that nothing else could match. The blowgun isn't a goblin invention. Archaeological evidence suggests that various human cultures developed blowguns independently, recognizing the value of a silent, accurate projectile weapon for hunting and warfare. What goblins did was adapt the weapon to their own physiology and tactical needs, refining it over generations until it became something uniquely suited to their particular strengths and circumstances. A goblin's lung capacity, proportional to their small body size, is actually quite impressive. Their chests are deeper than their diminutive frames would suggest. Their respiratory systems evolved or adapted to support intense bursts of activity. This gives them the power needed to propel darts through blowguns with surprising force. Their small stature, which might seem a disadvantage, actually provides benefits when using a blowgun. The weapon is easier to conceal, to aim with their lower center of gravity, to maneuver in spaces where larger warriors would struggle. But physical capability alone doesn't create mastery. The path from novice blowgun user to expert is long and demanding. Young goblins who show interest in the weapon, who demonstrate the patience and dedication required, begin training that will consume years of their lives. They start with tubes barely longer than their arms, learning to control their breath, to develop the muscle memory required for consistent aim, to understand how tiny adjustments in angle or breath pressure will affect where their dart strikes. The training progresses through stages, each one building on the last, each one revealing new layers of complexity that must be mastered before advancement is possible. Early training focuses purely on hitting stationary targets at close range. Once basic accuracy is achieved, distances increase gradually. Then moving targets are introduced, requiring students to learn leading their shots, predicting where an enemy will be when the dart arrives rather than simply aiming at where they are now. Advanced training incorporates environmental factors. Wind affects dart flight, requiring adjustments that experienced users make instinctively, but beginners must learn consciously. Temperature and humidity change how darts fly, how quickly they slow down, how they respond to the breath propelling them. Different darts behave differently, with variations in weight, balance, and tip design all affecting performance. Master blowgun users learn to select the right dart for each situation, adapting their technique to match the specific ammunition they're using. The pinnacle of blowgun mastery, achieved by only a handful of goblins in each generation, involves understanding the weapon at such a deep level that technique transcends into artistry. At this level, users don't consciously think about breath pressure or angle or dart selection. Their bodies know what to do, their muscles and lungs and eyes working together in perfect coordination, producing results that seem almost supernatural to those who don't understand the years of dedicated practice underlying each shot. This is the tradition the Dart Goblin was born into. Not the general tradition of goblin warfare, but the specific rarefied tradition of blowgun mastery. His path to expertise wasn't unique in its broad strokes. Many young goblins attempt to learn the blowgun. Most give up when they realize how demanding the training is. How many years must be invested before even basic competence is achieved? Those who persist face a grueling journey that tests not just physical skill, but mental fortitude, patience, and the ability to learn from failure without becoming discouraged. What made the Dart Goblin different? What allowed him to not just complete this training, but to excel, to become one of the acknowledged masters of his generation, was a combination of natural talent and obsessive dedication that bordered on mania. He didn't just practice because he was supposed to. He practiced because he couldn't imagine doing anything else. The blowgun called to something deep within him, spoke to a part of his nature that found perfect expression through the act of sending darts across impossible distances to strike targets with pinpoint accuracy. His instructors recognized this quality early. They saw in him the same fire that burned in all true masters, that refusal to accept good enough when perfection, while unattainable, could still be endlessly pursued. They pushed him harder than they pushed other students, demanded more, expected more, because they recognized that he could handle it, that he would thrive under pressure that would break others. And he did thrive, growing not just in skill but in understanding, developing the kind of deep, intuitive relationship with his weapon that separates competent practitioners from genuine artists. The Goblin clans have ancient records, stories and legends passed down through generations, telling of blowgun masters whose skills achieved legendary status. There was Keen-Eye Grick, who supposedly could hit a moving target at 200 paces while blindfolded, relying purely on sound to guide his aim. There was Silent Mort, who developed techniques for coating his darts in substances that would put enemies to sleep rather than killing them, turning his blowgun into a tool for capture rather than destruction. There was Whisper Deathfix, who mastered the art of shooting multiple darts in rapid succession, creating streams of projectiles that could overwhelm even armored opponents through sheer volume of accurate fire. The Dart Goblin studied these legends, learned everything known about these ancient masters, incorporated their techniques and innovations into his own developing style. But he didn't stop with mere imitation. He experimented, pushed boundaries, tried approaches that had never been documented, willing to fail repeatedly if it meant discovering something new, something that would give him an edge that even other masters lacked. His experiments weren't limited to pure technique. He studied materials, testing different types of bamboo to find those that produced the straightest, truest tubes. He investigated dart design, modifying shapes and weights and tip configurations, discovering combinations that flew straighter, hit harder, penetrated more effectively than traditional designs. He researched compounds that could be applied to dart tips, not to poison enemies, but to ensure that even glancing blows would slow them, weaken them, make them easier targets for follow-up shots. This research, this endless drive to improve and innovate, took him to places other goblins rarely visited. He traveled to remote goblin settlements, seeking out elders who remembered old techniques that younger generations had forgotten. He explored ancient goblin sites, locations where clans had lived centuries ago, searching through ruins for artifacts and records that might contain useful knowledge. He even risked ventures into non-goblin territories, observing how other species used projectile weapons, stealing ideas and adapting them to his own purposes. It was during one of these exploratory journeys that he first heard whispers of the Goblin temples. These weren't common knowledge, weren't locations that appeared on any maps or featured in the stories told to children. They were secrets, carefully guarded by the oldest Goblin families, spoken of only in hushed voices when elders thought younger members weren't listening. The temples were places of power, repositories of ancient Goblin magic and knowledge, protected by wards and traps that made them nearly inaccessible to all but the most determined seekers. The story said that within these temples could be found artifacts of immense power, objects created by Goblin ancestors who had mastered arts that modern Goblins barely understood, masks that granted enhanced perception, allowing users to see things others couldn't, potions that amplified natural abilities, turning competent warriors into formidable ones, weapons imbued with properties that transcended mere craftsmanship, that bordered on or crossed into the realm of magic. The Dart Goblin filed these stories away, cataloging them alongside all the other knowledge he accumulated during his journeys. He didn't particularly believe them. Ancient treasures and magical artifacts sounded like the stuff of children's tales, exaggerations built from small truths into grand fictions. But he remembered them nonetheless, because a good student of any craft learns to never completely dismiss anything, to keep even unlikely possibilities in mind, because sometimes, just sometimes, the unlikely proves true. He couldn't know, during those early years of training and travel, that those half-believed stories would eventually lead him to a transformation that would elevate him from mere master to something approaching legend. He couldn't predict that his path would lead him deep underground, into a miner's tunnel, and from there into a temple that shouldn't exist but did, where a mask waited that would change everything he thought. He knew about his capabilities and his destiny, but that revelation lay in the future, in a moment that we'll explore in its proper place in this narrative. For now, in this moment of his story, the Dart Goblin was still climbing toward mastery through conventional means, still honing his skills through practice and study, still believing that excellence came from discipline and dedication alone. He had no idea that forces older than he could imagine were already at work, guiding his steps toward a convergence of past and present, of ancient power and modern skill, that would reshape not just his own destiny, but the role of all blowgun specialists in the conflicts to come. The birth of a specialist. How the Dart Goblin came to be. Every master has an origin story, a beginning that seems humble, perhaps even unpromising, when viewed from the comfortable distance of hindsight. The goblin who would become known throughout the arena simply as the Dart Goblin began his life with no particular indication that he was destined for greatness. He was born into a mid-sized goblin clan, neither particularly prestigious nor especially poor. The kind of family that had survived for generations through competence rather than exceptional talent, through steady reliability rather than flash or innovation. His early years followed the patterns common to most young goblins. He learned to walk and run in that characteristic goblin scramble, all speed and apparent chaos, concealing actual coordination. He played the rough games that goblin children favor, learning to dodge and weave, to work together with others, to compete without creating genuine animosity. He sat around evening fires listening to the stories elders told, absorbing the history and values of his people, learning what it meant to be a goblin in a world populated by creatures both larger and smaller, stronger and weaker, more and less dangerous than his kind. The first hint that he might be different came when he was quite young, barely old enough to be trusted with any kind of implement that could be used as a weapon. The clan was engaged in one of their periodic hunts, seeking small game to supplement their food stores. Most young goblins his age would be left behind during these hunts, considered too inexperienced and too likely to accidentally cause problems. But he begged to be included, promised to stay quiet and follow instructions. wore down the adult's resistance through sheer persistent enthusiasm. During the hunt, he watched everything with intense focus that surprised the adults supervising him. He noticed how the wind affected the flight of thrown spears, how experienced hunters led their moving targets rather than aiming directly at them, how patience and stillness could be as valuable as speed and aggression. When one of the hunters used a blowgun to bring down a bird perched high in a tree, the young goblin's attention became absolutely fixed on the weapon and the technique required to use it. After the hunt, he pestered the blowgun user with questions. How did it work? How far could it shoot? How did you aim it? How long did it take to learn? The hunter, amused by this young goblin's intensity, answered patiently, even allowed him to hold the blowgun and examine it. The weapon was simple, just a hollow tube, but the young goblin handled it with reverence that seemed disproportionate to the object's apparent simplicity. From that moment, he became quietly obsessed. He fashioned crude approximations of blowguns from hollow reeds, using them to shoot small projectiles at targets he set up around the clan's settlement. His early attempts were spectacularly unsuccessful. The reeds were too flexible, too irregular, too weak to propel projectiles with any accuracy or force. His breath control was non-existent, alternating between too weak to move the projectile at all, and so strong it caused the makeshift tube to split apart. His aim was worse than random chance, with projectiles flying in wildly unpredictable directions. Any reasonable young goblin would have given up, would have recognized that this particular path wasn't meant for them, would have moved on to exploring other potential talents. But something in him refused to accept failure. He studied his attempts, tried to understand why they weren't working, made adjustments based on his observations. He begged the experienced hunter for advice, accepting criticism and correction with humility rare in one so young. He practiced obsessively, turning what should have been playtime into training sessions, driving himself with an intensity that worried some adults who observed it. The clan elders discussed him during their private councils. Some worried that he was developing an unhealthy fixation, that his single-minded focus on mastering the blowgun would prevent him from developing other skills that might prove more useful. Others recognized in him the spark that characterized all true masters of any craft, that refusal to accept limitations, that drive to excel that transcends normal motivation. The debate about what to do with this unusual young goblin continued for months. The issue resolved itself when he was approximately 7 years old. Still quite young by goblin standards, but old enough to begin more formal training in whatever specialty he seemed suited for. He approached the clan's master blowgun user, the same hunter who had first shown him the weapon, and formally requested to become an apprentice. The request itself was bold, perhaps even presumptuous. Apprenticeships in specialized skills like blowgun mastery were rarely offered to children so young. Most began their training in their early teenage years, after they demonstrated basic competence in general goblin skills. The master hunter could have dismissed the request, told the young goblin to come back in a few years after he'd matured more. Instead, he decided to test this would-be apprentice, to see whether his enthusiasm was backed by any actual potential or whether it was merely childish fixation that would fade when confronted with real challenge. The test was simple but revealing. The young goblin was given a proper blowgun. The first time, he'd held a true weapon rather than his makeshift reed approximations. He was shown a target at moderate distance, told to take as much time as he needed, and asked to hit it. Not to hit a specific point on the target, just to hit the target somewhere. The master hunter expected him to fail, or at best to succeed, only after many, many attempts. Failure would be fine, would be natural, would simply indicate that he needed more basic development before attempting serious training. Thought the young goblin approached the test, with seriousness that seemed almost comical in one so small and young. He examined the blowgun carefully, getting a feel for its weight and balance. He selected a dart from those offered, turning it over in his small hands, checking its straightness and the condition of its tip. He loaded it into the tube with careful deliberateness. He took his stance, adjusted his position slightly, then adjusted again. He brought the blowgun to his lips, closed his eyes for a moment, opened them with that distinctive goblin focus, and blew. The dart flew straight and true, embedding itself not in the outer edge of the target, but near the center. Not a perfect bullseye, but far better than anyone had expected from someone with essentially no formal training. The master hunter stared at the target, then at the young goblin, then back at the target. This wasn't beginner's luck. The stance had been good, the breath control adequate, the follow-through proper. This was someone with genuine natural talent for the weapon. The apprenticeship began the next day. The training was brutal, especially for one so young. Physical conditioning came first, building the lung capacity and core strength required for consistent blowgun use. Hours each day spent in breathing exercises, learning to control the diaphragm to generate steady pressure rather than explosive bursts, to maintain the control necessary for accuracy across multiple shots. His small body ached constantly during those early months, muscles developing that he'd never known he had. His rib cage expanding as his respiratory system adapted to demands far beyond normal goblin requirements. Simultaneously, he drilled basic technique: stance, grip, aim, breath, follow-through. Repeated thousands of times until they became automatic, until his body knew what to do without his mind having to consciously direct each element. His master was patient but demanding, correcting tiny flaws that seemed inconsequential to the young apprentice, but which would compound into serious problems if allowed to become habitual. A slightly wrong grip would affect aim. An improper stance would limit the power he could generate. Small errors now would become insurmountable obstacles later. The dart selection and care became its own area of study. He learned to identify quality bamboo for tube construction, understanding how grain patterns and growth characteristics affected the finished weapon's performance. He studied dart manufacture, the precise balance required between tip weight and shaft length, how even microscopic imperfections could send a dart veering off course. He learned maintenance protocols, how to keep his weapon clean and dry, how to repair minor damage. When damage was severe enough, the replacement was the only option. Years passed in this pattern, his entire childhood and early adolescence consumed by training that most young goblins his age would have found impossibly tedious. While others played and socialized and explored various interests, he practiced. While they slept late and enjoyed leisure time, he rose before dawn to train before the day's heat made conditions difficult. While they complained about minor inconveniences, he pushed through pain and frustration without complaint, driven by something deeper than conscious thought, something almost primal in its intensity. He wasn't friendless exactly, but he was certainly a part. Other young goblins respected his dedication, even as they found it somewhat alien to their own natures. He joined group activities occasionally, reminded by concerned adults that pure isolation wasn't healthy even for someone pursuing mastery. But even during these social moments, part of his attention remained on his training, on techniques he wanted to try, on adjustments he wanted to test. The blowgun wasn't just what he did. It was becoming what he was, his identity crystallizing around this one particular expression of goblin warfare. His breakthrough to true competence came during his 13th year. Competence had been building gradually, each day slightly better than the last, improvements so incremental as to be almost invisible from day to day. But breakthrough moments still occur. Points where accumulated small improvements suddenly coalesce into a qualitative change in capability. For him, it happened during a particularly challenging drill. His master had set up targets at progressively greater distances, starting at ranges where hits were easy and extending to distances that even experienced users found challenging. The instruction was simple: hit every target in sequence, as quickly as accuracy allowed, using only the darts provided with no resupply. Failure to hit any target meant starting the entire sequence over. He'd attempted this drill dozens of times over previous weeks, never succeeding. He'd get through the early targets easily, manage the middle distances with difficulty, and inevitably fail somewhere in the long-distance shots, either missing entirely or running out of darts before completing the sequence. Each failure was documented, analyzed, turned into lessons for the next attempt. But success had remained frustratingly out of reach. On this attempt, something was different. He felt it before the first dart left his tube, a sense of alignment, of everything working together rather than fighting against itself. His breathing was perfect, his stance solid, his mind clear of doubt and expectation. He moved through the sequence in a kind of flow state, each shot seeming to happen by itself, his conscious mind observing rather than controlling, trusting the training to guide his body through actions that had been practiced so many thousands of times. Target after target fell. Close range, medium range, long range. Stationary targets and the few moving ones his master had included. Each dart flying true, finding its mark, the satisfying thunk of impact barely registering consciously as his attention was already moving to the next shot, the next target. And then suddenly, unexpectedly, he was done. Every target hit. Darts remaining unused. The drill completed, finally, after so many failures. His master had been watching from a distance, not interfering, letting the apprentice work through the drill independently. Now he approached with an expression that mixed pride and something more complex, perhaps a touch of sadness. Pride because his apprentice had achieved something significant, had crossed a threshold that separated novices from practitioners. Sadness because this success meant their relationship was changing, that the days of simple master and apprentice hierarchy were ending, that the young goblin was becoming something that demanded different respect. After that day, the training shifted. It was no longer about building fundamental skills, but about refinement, about pushing already competent capabilities toward excellence and beyond. The targets became smaller, the distances greater, the conditions more challenging. He practiced in wind and rain and darkness, in situations designed to simulate the chaos of actual combat. He learned to shoot while moving, while dodging, while under pressure from multiple simultaneous demands on his attention. His reputation within the clan grew. He was no longer just the obsessed young goblin who did nothing but practice with his blowgun. He was becoming recognized as genuinely skilled, someone whose abilities exceeded what most clan members had ever witnessed. When hunting parties went out, they began specifically requesting his inclusion, knowing that his presence increased their success rate dramatically. When demonstrations of goblin capabilities were given for visitors or allies, he was trotted out to show what blowgun masters could achieve. But recognition within his clan wasn't enough for him, wasn't the endpoint of his journey. He wanted more, needed more, craved the kind of challenge and validation that only came from proving himself against the best in the world, rather than just the best in his immediate community. He began seeking opportunities to test himself more broadly, to see how his skills measured against those of other specialists. This drive led him to compete in inter-clan contests, events where goblins from multiple clans would gather to demonstrate and compete across various specialties. He entered blowgun competitions, facing opponents who had trained as long and as hard as he had, who brought their own innovations and techniques to bear. These competitions were revealing, humbling, educational. He won more often than he lost, but he did lose, discovering that his mastery, while impressive, wasn't yet at the absolute pinnacle of what was possible. Each loss taught him something. He studied the techniques of those who bested him, incorporated their innovations where they improved his own approach, discarded what didn't fit his style. He made connections with other specialists, forming relationships that transcended clan boundaries. building a network of peers who shared his obsessive dedication to their craft. From these peers, he learned that mastery was never finished, that there was always another level, always another refinement possible. It was during one of these inter-clan gatherings that he first heard the term others were beginning to use for him. Not his birth name, not his clan affiliation, but simply the Dart Goblin. The name had apparently started as informal shorthand, a way for other competitors to refer to that one goblin who's really good with darts. But it stuck, spreading beyond just the competition circuit, becoming his primary identifier. He didn't mind. In fact, he found he preferred it, the Dart Goblin. It was direct, descriptive, unpretentious. It declared what he was without false modesty, but also without arrogance. He was a goblin who used darts, who had made that simple fact into his entire identity, who had taken one very specific tool and mastered it so completely that he required no other description. The name became his brand, his calling card, the thing that preceded him into any new situation. By the time the summons came, the invitation to take his skills into the Clash Royale arena, he was approaching the height of his capabilities. Not quite at the absolute peak, still climbing, still improving, but undeniably among the elite practitioners of his craft. The arena represented a new challenge, a new context for demonstrating his mastery. It would test him in ways inter-clan competitions never had, forcing him to adapt his skills to situations more chaotic and dangerous than anything he previously experienced. He accepted the invitation without hesitation. This was what he'd been training for, even if he hadn't consciously known it. All those years of practice, all that obsessive dedication, all the sacrifices he'd made in pursuit of excellence, all of it had been building toward this moment. The Dart Goblin was ready to show the world, ready to prove that even small warriors with simple weapons could change the course of battles through perfect execution of their craft. The arena awaited. And he was ready. The art of the blowgun, mastering distance and precision. Let's slow down now and really examine what makes the blowgun such a remarkable weapon, what separates it from every other projectile system used in arena combat, and why mastering it requires the kind of dedication that consumed the Dart Goblin's entire youth. Close your eyes and imagine holding one. Feel the smooth bamboo against your palms, surprisingly light yet solid. The hollow interior creating a perfect channel for your breath to travel through, to propel tiny projectiles across distances that seem impossible for such a simple mechanism. The physics of a blowgun are deceptively straightforward. You place a dart inside a tube. You blow air through the tube. The pressure differential propels the dart forward. But this simplicity masks extraordinary complexity when you examine what's actually required to achieve accuracy and power. Every variable matters. The diameter of the tube affects how much air pressure escapes around the dart versus how much pushes it forward. Too wide, and you lose power. Too narrow, and friction slows the dart or prevents it from moving at all. The length of the tube determines the distance over which air pressure can accelerate the dart. Longer tubes generally mean more power, but they also become unwieldy, harder to aim, more affected by even slight movements during the shot. The Dart Goblin's tube measures approximately 4 feet, significantly longer than his own height, the maximum length he can effectively manage given his size and strength. This length gives him the range to strike targets from 6.5 tiles away, a distance that puts him safely beyond the reach of most melee troops while allowing him to provide sustained ranged pressure. The bamboo itself must be carefully selected. Not all bamboo is equal. Some varieties have walls that are too thick, adding unnecessary weight without providing structural benefits. Others are too thin, liable to crack or split under the repeated stress of use. The grain must run straight and true along the entire length, without the knots or irregularities that would disrupt the smooth flow of air. Finding perfect bamboo requires knowledge of where and how different varieties grow, understanding which conditions produce the best material. Once suitable bamboo is found, it must be prepared. The interior nodes that naturally divide bamboo into segments must be carefully removed, creating a smooth, continuous bore. This is delicate work, requiring tools that can reach inside the narrow tube without damaging the walls. The smoothing process can take days, with the craftsman working patiently to eliminate any roughness that might catch darts or disrupt airflow. The exterior is sanded and treated with oils that prevent moisture absorption while improving grip. The darts themselves represent another entire field of specialized knowledge. Each one is a precision instrument, as carefully crafted as any arrow or crossbow bolt, but on a much smaller scale. The shaft must be perfectly straight, perfectly cylindrical, perfectly smooth. Even microscopic imperfections will cause the dart to tumble in flight rather than flying true. The balance point must be precisely positioned, typically weighted toward the front to ensure the tip stays pointed forward throughout its flight. The tips vary depending on intended use. For hunting small game, simple sharp points suffice, designed to penetrate and cause rapid death through bleeding or organ damage. For use against armored opponents, hardened tips that can punch through lighter armor materials might be used. The Dart Goblin. Combat darts feature tips that are sharp enough to pierce exposed flesh, but sturdy enough not to bend or break when striking harder materials. Each tip is individually inspected before being accepted for use, with any showing even minor flaws being rejected. The fletching on the darts serves the same purpose as on arrows, stabilizing flight by creating drag at the rear that keeps the dart oriented properly. But at the scale of blowgun darts, traditional feather fletching doesn't work well. Instead, the Dart Goblin uses small wrappings of thread or thin fabric, precisely positioned and precisely weighted to provide stability without adding excessive drag that would slow the dart prematurely. Getting this balance right requires experimentation and experience, understanding through trial and error what works or what doesn't. Breath control might be the single most important skill for any blowgun user. It's not about blowing as hard as you possibly can. Raw power without control produces inconsistent results, with some shots too weak and others so powerful they cause the weapon to move during firing, throwing off aim. Instead, proper breath control means generating consistent, sustainable pressure, the kind of steady force that propels darts with reliable velocity shot after shot. The technique begins with proper breathing from the diaphragm rather than shallow chest breathing. Deep breaths that fill the lungs completely, that draw air down into the lowest portions of the respiratory system where the most pressure can be generated. The Dart Goblin spent years really training his breathing, learning to take a deep breath, quickly and quietly to hold it briefly while aiming then to release it through the tube in a controlled exhale that maintains steady pressure from beginning to end. The timing of the breath release coordinates with the trigger pull of crossbows or the release of drawn bowstrings. Too early and your aim hasn't settled yet. Too late and you've been holding your breath so long that your body's demand for oxygen begins to affect your steadiness. The perfect moment is when your aim is settled, when your body is still, when you're balanced and ready, when everything aligns for a split second that you must seize immediately or lose. Aiming a blowgun differs from aiming most other projectile weapons. With bows or crossbows, you can use sights, can line up mechanical aids that help you judge the proper angle. With a blowgun, you're essentially point shooting, relying on your body's kinesthetic sense of where the tube is pointing rather than on visual confirmation. This requires developing an almost supernatural awareness of your weapon's orientation in space, knowing instinctively whether it's angled correctly without needing to consciously check. The Dart Goblin's training included thousands of hours of dry firing practice, going through the complete motion of aiming and shooting, but without actually releasing darts. This allowed him to build muscle memory without consuming ammunition, to refine his technique through pure repetition. He'd practice in front of reflective surfaces so he could observe his form, could see and correct any inconsistencies in his stance or grip or the angle of his tube. Distance judgment is crucial for any ranged weapon, but particularly for blowguns, where the relatively low velocity of projectiles means that gravity has significant time to affect flight paths. A dart aimed directly at a distant target will drop below the point of aim, falling progressively more as distance increases. Compensating for this drop requires understanding exactly how much your darts fall over various distances, building mental reference points that let you automatically adjust your aim based on your estimate of how far away the target stands. The Dart Goblin can estimate distances with remarkable accuracy, a skill developed through constant practice and refined through combat experience. Show him a target, and he can tell you almost instantly that it's at 4 tiles, or 5.5 tiles, or 6 tiles, and adjust his aim accordingly. This instant distance assessment happens so quickly and automatically that he is not consciously aware of doing it anymore. His mind processing visual information and making calculations below the level of conscious thought. Leading moving targets represents another layer of complexity. When shooting at something that's moving, you can't aim directly at where it is. You must aim at where it will be when your dart arrives, accounting for both the target's movement and your projectile's flight time. This requires not just distance judgment, but velocity judgment, estimating how fast the target is moving, predicting whether it will maintain that speed or change direction, calculating the intercept point where dart and target will meet. The math involved is complex, involving variables like relative angles, acceleration curves, and the three-dimensional nature of arena combat where targets might be moving toward you, away from you, or at angles that change their effective speed relative to your position. The Dart Goblin doesn't consciously calculate any of this. His brain, trained through thousands of shots at thousands of moving targets, simply knows. He sees a moving target. His hand adjusts the angle automatically, and his dart flies to the intercept point as if guided by precognition rather than practiced skill. Environmental factors add yet more complexity. Wind affects small, light projectiles like darts dramatically. A breeze that might barely deflect an arrow can send a dart several tiles off course over long distances. The Dart Goblin has learned to read wind, to feel its direction and strength, to make instant adjustments to compensate for its effects. He watches how grass moves, how dust drifts, how leaves flutter, using these visual cues to judge wind conditions without needing to consciously think about what he's observing. Temperature affects both the dart's flight characteristics and the blowgun's performance. Cold air is denser, providing more resistance, but also more consistent behavior. Hot air is thinner, requiring slightly more breath pressure to achieve the same velocities. Humidity changes how bamboo responds to stress, how darts behave in flight, how breath condenses inside the tube, potentially affecting accuracy. The Dart Goblin accounts for all of this automatically, his technique subtly adapting to conditions without requiring conscious adjustment. The rate of fire is both a strength and limitation. The Dart Goblin can shoot approximately 1 dart every 1.4 seconds, a respectable rate that allows him to maintain steady pressure on targets. But this rate is fixed by the physical requirements of loading, aiming, and firing. Unlike some troops who can speed up their attacks through various means, his rhythm is essentially unchangeable. This consistency is actually an advantage in some ways. Creating a predictable pattern he can build strategies around, but it also means he can't suddenly increase his output when situations demand burst damage. Reload technique matters enormously for maintaining this rate of fire. The Dart Goblin has refined his reload to minimal wasted motion. His darts are positioned for optimal access, arranged so his hand falls naturally to them without needing to search. The grab, the transfer to the tube, the loading, all happen in one fluid motion that barely interrupts his focus on aiming. During intense combat, his hands work almost independently of his conscious attention, reloading and preparing the next shot while his eyes are already tracking the next target. Stance and stability form the foundation for everything else. The Dart Goblin's stance when firing is distinctive, instantly recognizable to anyone who's studied his technique. His feet are spread for balance, his weight slightly forward on the balls of his feet, ready to move but stable while aiming. His core is tight, providing a solid platform that prevents unnecessary movement. His arms extend the tube toward the target, but not rigidly, maintaining slight flex that allows him to track moving targets smoothly. The follow-through after each shot is just as important as the shot itself. Poor follow-through, where the shooter moves or adjusts before the dart has left the tube, can ruin otherwise perfect aim. The Dart Goblin has trained himself to hold his position for a fractional second after firing, ensuring that his breath has completed its work, that the dart has exited the tube cleanly, that nothing he does disrupts the projectile's flight. Only after this brief hold does he transition to preparing his next shot. Psychological elements of blowgun mastery deserve consideration. The patience required to achieve excellence with this weapon tests even dedicated practitioners. Progress is slow, measured in tiny increments, with plateaus where improvement seems to stop entirely no matter how much you practice. The temptation to give up, to pursue faster paths to competence with other weapons, must be constantly resisted. The Dart Goblin's mental fortitude, his ability to persist through frustration and disappointment, proved as crucial to his development as any physical skill. Confidence built through competence creates a positive feedback loop. As the Dart Goblin became more skilled, his confidence grew, which allowed him to perform better under pressure, which further increased his confidence. But he also had to manage the ego that comes with mastery, had to remain humble enough to keep learning, to accept that no matter how good he became, there was always room for improvement. Arrogance would have stunted his growth, would have blinded him to his remaining weaknesses. The kinesthetic awareness developed through years of practice extends beyond just knowing where his weapon is pointing. The Dart Goblin has learned to be aware of his entire body, to sense tensions or asymmetries that might affect his shooting, to make micro-adjustments that optimize his stability and accuracy. He knows when his stance is slightly off, when his breathing isn't quite right, when some small element of his technique has degraded and needs correction. This body awareness, this constant internal monitoring, happens automatically now, his nervous system flagging issues before his conscious mind notices them. The zone, that mental state where peak performance becomes effortless, where time seems to slow and everything becomes clear, is something the Dart Goblin has learned to access reliably. Not every shot happens in the zone, but during his best performances, during those moments when everything aligns perfectly, he enters this state where thought disappears and pure action remains. His darts fly true without effort, without doubt, without the interference of conscious deliberation. This is the pinnacle of mastery, when the weapon becomes an extension of self rather than a tool you use. Teaching others has deepened the Dart Goblin's own understanding. When you explain techniques to beginners, when you break down what you do into steps that can be communicated and practiced, you often discover nuances in your own technique that you'd never consciously recognized. The Dart Goblin has trained several apprentices over the years, passing on his knowledge, and through teaching them he's refined his own grasp of why things work the way they do. Each student's questions force him to articulate principles that he previously only understood intuitively. The philosophy underlying his approach to the weapon is one of perfect execution over flashy technique. He doesn't do trick shots, doesn't pursue impressive but impractical skills. Everything he practices has direct application to combat effectiveness. This pragmatic focus has made him extraordinarily effective in actual battle, where consistency and reliability matter more than spectacular highlights. He might not be the most entertaining blowgun user to watch, but he's among the most dangerous to face. The blowgun's silence is a tactical advantage that shouldn't be overlooked. Unlike bows that twang, crossbows that click, or firearms that boom, the blowgun makes almost no sound when fired. The soft puff of breath, the faint whistle of the dart in flight, these are subtle sounds easily masked by battle chaos. Enemies often don't realize they're under attack from a blowgun user until darts start hitting them. Can't easily track the source of fire. Can't prepare defenses based on audio cues. This stealth aspect makes the Dart Goblin particularly valuable in tactical situations where drawing attention would be disadvantageous. The psychological impact on enemies shouldn't be underestimated either. There's something uniquely frustrating about being hit by darts from a source you can barely see, standing so far away that you can't effectively retaliate. The Dart Goblin has watched opponents become increasingly agitated as his darts find their marks again and again, seeing them make mistakes born of frustration, charging blindly forward or overcommitting resources in desperate attempts to silence his steady assault. This psychological pressure is as valuable as the physical damage his darts inflict. Every master develops their own style, their own small innovations that distinguish them from others who've achieved similar technical proficiency. The Dart Goblin's style emphasizes efficiency and sustainability over burst damage. He maintains steady pressure, never overextending, never taking shots that are too risky or too difficult. He picks his targets carefully, focusing on threats that his darts are most effective against. He positions himself to maximize his sightlines while minimizing his exposure. Everything he does reflects deep understanding of both his capabilities and his limitations. The art of the blowgun, as practiced by the Dart Goblin, is ultimately about control. Controlling your breath, your body, your weapon, your emotions, your position on the battlefield. It's about taking something inherently chaotic, combat against opponents who are trying to kill you, and imposing order on it through perfect execution of techniques refined over decades. It's about transforming simple tools, a tube and some pointed sticks, into instruments of precise devastation through sheer mastery. And now, as your mind drifts comfortably through these detailed explanations, as you understand more fully what the Dart Goblin represents, let yourself appreciate the dedication required to achieve this level of skill. Let yourself marvel at what humans and goblins alike can accomplish when they commit fully to mastering a craft. The blowgun itself is simple, but the mastery, the true mastery, is anything but simple. It's the work of a lifetime, and the Dart Goblin has done that work. Double trouble gum and didgeridoo lessons. Now we come to a peculiar but essential aspect of the Dart Goblin story, one that reveals the unexpected connections between different crafts, the surprising ways that mastering one skill can illuminate another, seemingly unrelated discipline. This chapter in his journey involves two things that might appear to have nothing to do with blowgun expertise: chewing gum and playing the didgeridoo. Yet both proved instrumental in developing the unique capabilities that define the Dart Goblin's approach to combat. The Double Trouble Gum story begins during a period when the Dart Goblin was plateauing in his development. He'd achieved competence, even excellence, but felt he'd hit a ceiling. His accuracy was good, but not perfect. His stamina was impressive, but not unlimited. He could maintain his rate of fire for extended periods, but eventually fatigue would set in, his breath control degrading, his accuracy suffering. He needed something that would push him past this plateau, some innovation or technique that would elevate him from very good to truly exceptional. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. During a trading expedition to acquire new bamboo, he encountered a vendor selling various curiosities and novelties. Among these was something called Double Trouble Gum, a substance allegedly created by goblin alchemists experimenting with tree saps and various herbs. The vendor's pitch was typical salesman exaggeration, claiming the gum granted enhanced focus, improved stamina, sharpened reflexes. The Dart Goblin was skeptical, but the price was low and his curiosity was piqued. He tried the gum that evening, expecting nothing. The texture was unusual, more elastic and resistant than ordinary tree sap. requiring significant jaw strength to chew. The flavor was complex, starting sweet, then transitioning through herbal notes that were simultaneously refreshing and slightly medicinal. But the interesting part came after several minutes of chewing. His breathing seemed to deepen naturally, his awareness of his respiratory system becoming more acute. The mild stimulant properties helped maintain focus without creating jittery energy that would interfere with fine motor control. Intrigued, he began experimenting systematically. He'd chew the gum before practice sessions, carefully noting whether his performance changed. The results were subtle but consistent. His endurance improved, allowing him to maintain peak performance for longer before fatigue set in. His breath control became more precise, the enhanced respiratory awareness translating into better ability to generate exactly the pressure he wanted. Most surprisingly, the act of chewing itself seemed to help, the rhythmic jaw movement somehow centering his focus, creating a meditative state conducive to peak performance. The mechanism wasn't entirely clear. Perhaps the gum's herbal components actually did have mild performance-enhancing properties. Perhaps the act of chewing increased blood flow, improving oxygen delivery to his brain and muscles. Perhaps it was entirely psychological, a placebo effect that worked because he believed it would. The Dart Goblin didn't particularly care about the mechanism. What mattered was that it worked, that chewing this peculiar substance before and during practice sessions seemed to help him push past previous limitations. He incorporated double trouble gum into his routine, never becoming dependent on it but using it strategically during intensive training or particularly important competitions. Other blowgun specialists noticed his improvement, asked about his methods. Some dismissed the gum story as superstition or placebo. Others tried it themselves and reported varying results. The Dart Goblin didn't evangelize, didn't try to convince skeptics. He simply continued using something that worked for him, that gave him an edge however slight. The didgeridoo connection is even more unexpected, but perhaps more significant for understanding how the Dart Goblin developed his extraordinary breath control. The didgeridoo is an ancient wind instrument, originating from human indigenous cultures, producing deep droning tones through a technique called circular breathing. Circular breathing allows the player to maintain continuous sound by breathing in through the nose while simultaneously pushing air out through the mouth using air stored in the cheeks. It's a difficult technique, taking months or years to master, but once learned, it enables sustained performance that would be impossible with normal breathing. The Dart Goblin first encountered a didgeridoo during a cultural exchange between goblin clans and some human allies. The human demonstrating the instrument explained the circular breathing technique, and something clicked in the Dart Goblin's mind. If he could master circular breathing, if he could learn to maintain air pressure continuously rather than in discrete breaths, it might translate into improved blowgun performance. Even if he couldn't literally shoot darts while inhaling, the enhanced control over his breathing apparatus might provide benefits for rapid successive shots. He obtained a didgeridoo through trade, likely overpaying given his eagerness, and began practicing. The early attempts were humbling. He'd achieved mastery with his blowgun, had confidence in his respiratory control, and now here he was making sounds like a dying animal. Unable to maintain even a steady tone, let alone master the complex circular breathing technique. But frustration only intensified his determination. If this was difficult, if it challenged him, that meant it was worth pursuing. The circular breathing practice required completely retraining his breathing patterns. He had to learn to separate the actions of inhaling through his nose and exhaling through his mouth, to coordinate them such that one didn't interfere with the other. He had to develop his cheek muscles, learning to use them as a sort of secondary air reservoir that could maintain pressure while his diaphragm was engaged in pulling in fresh breath. The coordination required seemed impossible at first, like trying to pat your head and rub your belly while also hopping on one foot. Weeks passed with minimal progress. Then, Gradually, breakthrough moments began occurring. He'd maintain the circular breathing pattern for a few seconds before losing coordination and having to stop. Then longer periods, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, a full minute. The didgeridoo's drone became steadier, more consistent as his control improved. His lung capacity increased from the constant practice. His awareness of his respiratory system, already good, became extraordinary. Able to sense and control aspects of his breathing he'd never consciously noticed before. The translation to blowgun performance was everything he'd hoped for and more. While he couldn't literally circular breathe while shooting, the enhanced respiratory control allowed him to recover faster between shots, to maintain peak pressure more consistently, to extend his effective combat endurance significantly. His rate of fire didn't increase, still limited by the mechanical requirements of loading and aiming, but the quality of each shot improved. The consistency across long strings of successive shots, reaching levels he'd never achieved before. More subtly, the didgeridoo practice improved his mental discipline. Maintaining circular breathing requires constant focus, constant attention to the coordination of multiple simultaneous actions. This mental training translated into better ability to maintain combat focus under pressure, to keep track of multiple variables simultaneously, to avoid the tunnel vision that sometimes afflicts warriors during intense engagements. His battlefield awareness improved, his ability to track threats and opportunities, while maintaining his own performance reaching new heights. Other goblins found the Dart Goblin's dedication to these unusual training methods somewhat eccentric. Chewing gum before battles, spending hours producing strange droning sounds on an instrument nobody else played. These activities seemed tangential at best to improving combat effectiveness. But the results spoke for themselves. His performance metrics improved across every measure. His competitive record strengthened. His reputation grew as someone who would pursue any advantage, no matter how unconventional, no matter how much additional work it required. The combination of double trouble gum and didgeridoo practice created synergistic benefits that exceeded what either would provide alone. The gum helped him maintain focus during long didgeridoo sessions, while the breath control from didgeridoo practice let him maximize the performance benefits the gum provided. Together, they represented his philosophy of constant improvement, of leaving no potential advantage unexplored, of building excellence through accumulated marginal gains rather than searching for single transformative breakthroughs. This period of his development also taught him valuable lessons about the importance of cross-training, of exploring skills and disciplines outside your primary focus. If he'd remained narrowly focused only on direct blowgun practice, he'd have missed these tremendous sources of improvement. By remaining curious, by investigating anything that might potentially help even if the connection wasn't obvious, he'd discovered training methods that none of his predecessors or competitors had thought to explore. The mental state induced by his pre-combat routine, chewing double trouble gum while reviewing his equipment and running through breathing exercises derived from his didgeridoo practice, became as important as any technical skill. This routine created consistency, put him in the right psychological space for optimal performance, signaled to his nervous system that it was time to elevate into combat mode. Other warriors might rush into battle, might deploy without proper preparation, but the Dart Goblin's disciplined approach meant he was always as ready as possible when combat began. The mask that covers the Dart Goblin's face is far more than protective equipment or decorative accessory. It's a profound statement about his identity, his connection to Goblin spiritual traditions, and his relationship with the forces that govern life and death in the arena. To truly understand the Dart Goblin, we must explore what the voodoo mask represents, where it came from, and why wearing it matters so deeply to who he has become. Goblin material culture includes various forms of masks, each type carrying specific meanings and associations. Work masks protect from dust or fumes during certain manufacturing processes. celebration masks are worn during festivals and ceremonies, often depicting specific spirits or ancestral figures. Combat masks serve practical purposes like protecting the face from weapon strikes or making the wearer appear more intimidating. But voodoo masks occupy a different category entirely, one that blends practical function with spiritual significance in ways that transcend simple utility. The term voodoo itself carries complex meanings, drawn from real-world spiritual traditions, but adapted and transformed within the Clash universe into something distinct. In this context, voodoo refers to practices that seek to connect with and influence spiritual forces, to communicate with entities that exist beyond the purely physical realm, to tap into powers that transcend normal goblin capabilities. It's part magic, part religion, part practical craft, a synthesis that defies easy categorization. Voodoo masks in goblin tradition serve as interfaces between the physical and spiritual realms. The carved wood, treated and prepared through specific processes known only to specialized craftsmen, becomes more than mere material. It becomes a vessel capable of holding and channeling energies that wouldn't normally manifest in the physical world. The act of wearing such a mask creates a temporary bond, allows the wearer to access capabilities they wouldn't normally possess, transforms them into something greater than they'd be without it. The Dart Goblin's specific mask was not purchased or randomly found. It was earned through a process that tested not just his physical capabilities, but his spiritual readiness, his worthiness to bear the responsibility that came with wearing such a powerful artifact. The story of how he obtained his mask is one he rarely shares, considering it deeply personal, almost sacred. But the basic outline is known to those who've earned his trust sufficiently that he felt comfortable revealing this part of his history. The quest began when he'd achieved initial mastery of the blowgun, recognized as competent by his instructors and peers, but feeling that something was missing, that he hadn't yet reached his full potential. He sought counsel from goblin elders, those who remembered traditions that younger generations had begun to forget. They spoke cryptically about masks of power, about trials that would test whether a warrior was ready to take the next step in their development. They wouldn't provide specifics, couldn't give him a map or clear instructions. The path had to be discovered rather than followed. He spent months researching, gathering fragments of information from various sources. Old stories that mentioned masks with special properties. Legends about warriors who'd achieved impossible feats while wearing them. Hints about where such masks might be found or created. Gradually, a picture emerged. There were craftsmen, rare and secretive, who knew the ancient techniques for creating voodoo masks. These craftsmen didn't advertise their services, didn't take commissions from just anyone. You had to find them, had to convince them you were worthy of their work, had to undergo tests they devised to prove your readiness. The search led him to remote locations, areas where goblin civilization was thin, and the old ways still held more influence than modern practices. He encountered communities that lived as goblins had centuries ago, maintaining traditions that most clans had abandoned or significantly modified. He learned that what he sought wasn't simply a physical object, but a transformative experience, that obtaining a true voodoo mask would change him in ways he couldn't fully predict or control. When he finally found a mask craftsman willing to work with him, the process began with evaluation. The craftsman examined him physically, assessing his build and capabilities. But more importantly, the craftsman studied him spiritually, using methods the Dart Goblin didn't fully understand to evaluate his character, his intentions, the strength and alignment of his inner self. This spiritual assessment took days, during which the Dart Goblin meditated, fasted, underwent various trials designed to reveal his true nature. The craftsman finally declared him worthy, but warned that the mask he would create would be specifically attuned to the Dart Goblin's particular nature and needs. It would enhance what was already strong within him, while providing support in areas where he was weaker. But it would also demand things, would require him to maintain certain standards of behavior and focus, would bind him to responsibilities that came with wielding spiritual power. The Dart Goblin accepted these conditions without fully understanding what they meant, trusting that he'd learn through experience. The creation process took weeks. The craftsman selected wood from specific trees, harvested according to ritual protocols that honored the tree spirits and ensured the material would properly accept the spiritual energies it needed to hold. The carving happened in sacred space, with the craftsman entering trance states that allowed him to perceive the spiritual dimensions of his work, shaping the physical wood while simultaneously shaping its metaphysical properties. The Dart Goblin was required to be present during much of this process, meditating nearby, adding his own spiritual energy to the work, creating the bond between mask and wearer that would make the artifact functional rather than merely decorative. He witnessed the craftsman painting intricate patterns, each stroke imbued with intention, each color chosen for specific spiritual properties. He watched as small objects, fetishes, and charms were affixed to the mask, each one serving as an anchor for particular energies or capabilities. The eyes of the mask received special attention. These weren't merely carved openings that allowed the wearer to see. They were windows that would enhance perception, allow the wearer to detect things normal senses might miss. The craftsman embedded small crystals within the eye sockets, materials that would catch and focus spiritual energies related to vision and awareness. When completed, the eyes would glow with red light, marking the mask as active, as properly connected to the forces it was designed to channel. The completion ritual occurred at night, under conditions the craftsman had determined were spiritually optimal. The Dart Goblin was instructed to wear the mask for the first time during this ritual, to allow the final bonding between mask and wearer to occur under controlled conditions where the craftsman could monitor the process and intervene if something went wrong. The Dart Goblin placed the mask on his face, feeling the wood settle against his skin, the interior surfaces shaped to fit him perfectly. The sensation was overwhelming. Energy flowed into him through the mask, spiritual force that made his nerves sing and his blood race. His vision expanded, not just seeing further or more clearly, but perceiving dimensions of reality he'd never accessed before. He could sense the spiritual presences around him, the craftsman's powerful aura, the lingering spirits of the trees that had provided the wood, the vast web of spiritual connections that linked all living things. The experience lasted only moments before the craftsman gently removed the mask, but those moments changed him fundamentally, showed him possibilities he'd never imagined. The craftsman explained that acclimation would take time, that he should wear the mask in gradually increasing durations, allowing his spirit to adjust to the energies it channeled. Pushing too hard, too fast could damage him spiritually, could create imbalances that would be difficult or impossible to correct. The Dart Goblin followed these instructions carefully, building his tolerance slowly, learning to control the flood of enhanced perception rather than being overwhelmed by it. As he adapted to the mask, its benefits became increasingly apparent. His already impressive distance judgment became supernatural. He could estimate ranges with accuracy that seemed impossible, could detect minute changes in distance as targets moved toward or away from him. His awareness of wind and environmental factors expanded, allowing him to account for conditions that would normally be too subtle to consciously perceive. Most importantly, his focus deepened, distractions falling away, his consciousness able to maintain perfect concentration, even in the chaos of arena combat. But the mask also imposed obligations, as the craftsman had warned. He found he couldn't lie while wearing it, the spiritual energies disrupting any attempt at deception. He had to maintain certain ethical standards, found himself unable to attack obviously helpless targets or pursue tactics that violated his core values. The mask was guiding him, shaping his behavior in subtle ways, ensuring that its power served purposes aligned with deeper spiritual principles. The visual aspect of the mask, the way it made him appear to others, carried its own significance. The carved features, simultaneously fierce and dignified, declared him as someone who'd committed to a path of spiritual warrior development. The glowing red eyes marked him as someone who saw beyond normal perception, whose awareness extended into realms most couldn't access. The decorations dangling from the mask, rope and leaves in team colors, showed his integration of ancient spiritual tradition with modern arena service. Other goblins who understood voodoo traditions recognized what his mask represented, accorded him additional respect based not just on his combat capabilities, but on his spiritual achievement. Those unfamiliar with the traditions sometimes found the mask disturbing, the glowing eyes and carved features creating an impression of something more than merely goblin, something that transcended normal categories. This slight unsettling effect actually served tactical purposes, making opponents marginally less comfortable facing him, creating small psychological advantages that could matter in close engagements. The mask required maintenance, not just physical cleaning but spiritual renewal. Periodically, he'd perform rituals learned from the craftsman, recharging the spiritual energies, ensuring the bond remained strong and clear. Neglecting this maintenance would cause the mask to lose potency, its enhanced capabilities fading until it became merely decorative. The Dart Goblin was scrupulous about maintenance, treating the mask with the same obsessive care he gave his blowgun, recognizing that both were essential tools that deserved proper respect. The mask also connected him to a broader community of spiritual practitioners, goblins and sometimes other species who worked with similar traditions. He'd occasionally encounter others wearing masks of power, would exchange subtle signs of recognition, would sometimes share knowledge or experiences during these chance meetings. This hidden network existed beneath the surface of arena culture, rarely visible to outsiders but providing support and resources to its members. His relationship with the mask evolved over time, the bond deepening as years of use strengthened the connections between mask and wearer. It began to feel less like wearing a separate object and more like expressing an aspect of his true self, the spiritual warrior he'd become. The distinction between masked and unmasked states blurred somewhat, the enhanced perceptions and focused mindset becoming increasingly accessible even when he wasn't physically wearing it, though they remained strongest when mask was in place. Now, as you drift through these explanations of mask and meaning, of spiritual tradition and practical power, let yourself appreciate how something as simple as a carved piece of wood can become something so much more significant. The mask represents the Dart Goblin's commitment to not just physical mastery, but spiritual development. His recognition that true excellence requires more than technical skill, that the greatest warriors integrate all aspects of themselves into unified wholeness. The voodoo mask is who he is, worn on the outside but reflecting inner truth. Arena debut, January 2017, and the Meta Revolution, the 13th day of January 2017. Mark this date in the annals of Clash Royale history, for this was when everything changed for ranged combat in the arena. The Dart Goblin made his debut, and the meta would never quite be the same again. Let's slow down and really explore what this introduction meant, how it unfolded, and why a small green figure with a bamboo tube became one of the most impactful additions the game had seen in months. Before the Dart Goblin's arrival, the ranged support meta had settled into comfortable patterns. Players understood their options. 3 elixir bought you 2 archers, reliable damage dealers with decent range and the ability to split into separate lanes. 4 elixir got you a musketeer, higher single target damage and respectable health. 6 elixir brought the wizard with his area damage capabilities. Each option had clear use cases, clear strengths and limitations. Deck builders knew how these pieces fit together, had optimized compositions that had been tested through thousands of battles. The announcement that a new ranged troop was coming generated immediate interest in the community. Supercell revealed details gradually, building anticipation. a goblin with a blowgun. 3 elixir cost, making him compete directly with archers for deck slots. Rare rarity, more accessible than epic or legendary cards, but requiring more effort to upgrade than commons. Unlockable from Jungle Arena, meaning players would need to progress reasonably far before accessing him, but not so far that he'd be limited to only the most dedicated players. The revealed statistics were intriguing, but didn't immediately convey how revolutionary he'd be. His range of 6.5 tiles exceeded that of archers and musketeer, matching only the princess among troops available at the time. His damage per hit was moderate, lower than musketeer, but higher than individual archers. His hit speed of 1.4 seconds meant he could pump out consistent damage over time. His health was low, vulnerable to many spells and focused fire, but not so fragile that he'd be useless. What the bare statistics didn't communicate was how these elements would combine in actual gameplay. The range advantage seemed nice, but not necessarily game-changing. The damage and hit speed looked solid, but not spectacular. Most players expected him to be a decent, but not dominant addition, something that might find niche use, but probably wouldn't revolutionize anything. They were wrong. The first players to unlock and deploy the Dart Goblin in actual arena combat discovered immediately that something special had arrived. The range wasn't just slightly better than alternatives. It was transformatively better, allowing him to attack from positions that were simply unreachable for most troops. He could stand safely behind Prince's towers and attack enemy troops or buildings, without ever exposing himself to counterattack from most melee units. He could provide sustained pressure on enemy towers while remaining far enough back that opponents could uneasily threaten him without committing significant resources. The hit speed, combined with his range, created a rhythm of constant pressure that opponents found incredibly difficult to deal with. Unlike troops that attacked slowly, giving opponents time to respond between strikes, the Dart Goblin just kept firing. Dart after dart after dart, a relentless stream of projectiles that accumulated into serious damage if not addressed. Players quickly learned that ignoring a Dart Goblin was never an option. He had to be countered, had to be eliminated or at minimum distracted, or he would simply dismantle your tower through sustained fire. His role as a defensive powerhouse became apparent within days of his release. Deployed reactively against enemy pushes, he could eliminate supporting troops with remarkable efficiency. His fast hit speed meant he brought down minions and bats quickly. His range let him attack enemy troops while staying safely behind your own tanks or defensive structures. He excelled at cleaning up after big spells had weakened enemy formations, finishing off damaged troops before they could reach your towers. A 4 elixir investment could stop 8 or 9 elixir pushes if the Dart Goblin was positioned correctly and given time to work. The Prince's comparison was inevitable and immediate. Both had 9-tile range, though data miners quickly discovered the Dart Goblin actually had 6.5 tiles rather than the full 9 that Princes enjoyed. Both cost 3 elixir. Both provided sustained ranged pressure, but the differences were equally significant. Princes had splash damage, threatening grouped units in ways the Dart Goblin couldn't match. She could force responses through chip damage on towers from complete safety. But she had extremely low health, dying to log and other spells instantly, making her a risky investment against prepared opponents. The Dart Goblin's higher health changed the calculation significantly. He survived log, forcing opponents to use more expensive answers like arrows or commit troops to eliminate him. This made him more reliable in many situations, less vulnerable to the instant removal the Princess constantly risked. Competitive players began experimenting with running both Princess and Dart Goblin, creating dual sniper compositions that forced opponents to have multiple answers ready or accept constant chip damage from at least one source. The impact on popular deck archetypes was immediate and profound. Log-bait strategies, which relied on forcing opponents to use their log spell on Goblin Barrel rather than other swarm threats, suddenly had another dimension. Opponents who logged your goblin gang or skeleton army left their towers vulnerable to Dart Goblin. The cycling rhythm of bait decks, playing cheap cards rapidly to return to your win condition, suited the Dart Goblin perfectly, since his 3 elixir cost fit smoothly into cycle patterns. Siege decks discovered the Dart Goblin was perhaps their greatest defensive asset. X-bow and mortar strategies that needed to protect their siege buildings from enemy counterattacks found that the Dart Goblin provided exactly the kind of defensive support they required. He could eliminate swarms that would normally overwhelm siege buildings. He could provide sustained damage against tanks trying to reach and destroy the X-bow. He could be placed to cover the siege building while maintaining safe distance from most threats, surviving long enough to fulfill his protective role. Spell bait strategies evolved significantly with the Dart Goblin's introduction. He became another spell-vulnerable target that had to be addressed, but using spells on him meant those spells weren't available for other threats. The decision trees became more complex. Do you arrow the Dart Goblin to stop his sustained damage, potentially leaving yourself vulnerable to minion horde? Do you save arrows for air threats and try to reach the Dart Goblin with melee troops, accepting the damage he'll deal while you close the distance? Every choice had trade-offs, and skilled players exploited opponents' decisions ruthlessly. The community's initial reactions to the Dart Goblin ranged from enthusiasm to concern to outright declarations that he was overpowered and needed immediate nerfs. Usage rates climbed rapidly as more players unlocked and upgraded him. Within 2 weeks of his release, he was appearing in over 30% of decks at competitive trophy ranges, a remarkable adoption rate for a newly released card. Professional players featured him in tournament decks almost immediately, recognizing that his unique combination of range, reliability, and cost efficiency made him extremely valuable. Balanced discussions dominated forums and social media. Some players insisted he was perfectly balanced, that his low health and vulnerability to many spells created sufficient counterplay. Others argued that his range was simply too oppressive, that allowing a troop to attack from such safety while providing such consistent damage fundamentally broke the game's design principles. The debates were passionate, sometimes contentious, reflecting how significant the Dart Goblin's impact had been on the established meta. Supercell monitored usage and win rate data carefully, as they always did with new releases. The statistics told a complex story. The Dart Goblin's win rate was strong, but not broken, sitting in a healthy range that suggested good balance. But his usage rate was extremely high, indicating he might be too universally effective, too good in too many situations. This combination of metrics, good but not excessive win rate alongside very high usage rate, suggested he was probably slightly too powerful, but not catastrophically so. The first balance adjustment came in February 2017, just weeks after his release. His hit points were reduced by 6%, from 231 to 218 at tournament standard levels. This wasn't a massive nerf, but it shifted certain interactions. He became more vulnerable to chip damage from various sources, died slightly faster when opponents committed troops to eliminate him. The change was enough to bring his usage rate down modestly without destroying his viability. Exactly the kind of surgical adjustment that good balanced design requires. Players adapted quickly to the nerf, adjusting their placement and support strategies to account for his slightly reduced survivability. The fundamental strengths that made him valuable remained intact. His range still exceeded most alternatives. His damage output over time was still impressive. He was still an excellent defensive tool and sustainable source of offensive pressure. The nerf acknowledged he'd been slightly too strong without removing him from competitive viability. The meta continued evolving around the Dart Goblin's presence. Counter strategies developed as players identified reliable ways to deal with him. Rush strategies that closed distance quickly, overwhelming him before his sustained damage could accumulate. Spell timing strategies that waited for him to be deployed, then immediately answered with arrows or fireball. Building placement strategies that blocked his line of sight or forced him to move into vulnerable positions. The community's collective intelligence found answers, as it always does, preventing any single strategy or card from remaining dominant indefinitely. But even as counters developed, the Dart Goblin maintained relevance. Good players learned to position him more carefully, to protect him with tanks or buildings, to deploy him at moments when opponents' spell counters had already been used on other threats. The skill ceiling for optimal Dart Goblin usage proved surprisingly high, with significant differences between mediocre deployment and expert positioning. This depth ensured he remained interesting and valuable, even after players learned how to counter basic strategies involving him. His impact extended beyond just the cards and strategies directly involving him. His presence in the meta forced changes to deck construction across the board. Decks needed reliable answers to long-range threats, or they'd be picked apart by Dart Goblins they could ineffectively reach. This pushed certain cards into higher usage, particularly those that could threaten him cost-efficiently. It pushed other cards out of favor, particularly those that struggled to deal with sustained ranged pressure. The entire ecosystem shifted, adjusting around this new element that had been introduced. Content creators embraced the Dart Goblin enthusiastically. YouTube videos analyzing his mechanics, showcasing effective usage, explaining optimal positioning strategies. Twitch streams featuring Dart Goblin-focused decks, demonstrating techniques live while engaging with audiences. Reddit discussions dissecting his impact on various deck archetypes, theory crafting new compositions that leveraged his unique capabilities. The community engagement around his release was remarkable, demonstrating how much impact a well-designed new card could have on player investment and interest. Tournament play proved the Dart Goblin's competitive viability definitively. Major events in the months following his release featured him prominently, with top players incorporating him into various successful strategies. Championship matches came down to crucial Dart Goblin positioning, with subtle placement differences determining whether pushes succeeded or failed. Professional players praised his design, noting that he added strategic depth without breaking the game, created interesting decisions without being frustrating to play against. The January 2017 release established the Dart Goblin as a permanent fixture in the Clash Royale landscape. He wasn't a gimmick that would fade after initial novelty wore off. He wasn't a niche pick that only worked in specific situations. He was a legitimate, versatile troop that could contribute effectively across multiple deck archetypes and playstyles. His debut marked the beginning of a journey that would see him become one of the game's most iconic and enduring cards, respected by players of all skill levels for his unique combination of accessibility and depth. The psychology of range. 6.5 tiles of dominance there. That's something profound happening when the Dart Goblin stands at his maximum effective range, something that transcends simple mechanical advantage and enters the realm of psychological warfare. That 6.5 tile distance creates dynamics that affect not just gameplay mechanics, but player mentality, decision-making under pressure, and the fundamental experience of both using and facing this small green sniper. Let's explore the psychology of range, understanding why distance matters so much beyond the obvious tactical advantages it provides. Range in combat, whether digital or physical, represents safety. The farther you can attack from, the less exposed you are to counterattack, the more control you have over engagement terms. But it's not just about safety. Range represents power, the ability to affect enemies who cannot affect you, to shape the battlefield from a position of relative invulnerability. This power creates psychological effects that are as important as the physical damage dealt. When facing a Dart Goblin, opponents experience a specific form of frustration that range uniquely generates. You can see him standing there, can watch the darts flying toward your troops or towers, can calculate the damage accumulating, but you can't immediately do anything about it. If you're playing melee troops, you have to close what feels like an enormous distance before you can engage, all while taking damage from his uninterrupted fire. If you're playing shorter range troops, you're in an awkward position where you can almost reach him, but not quite, creating the maddening experience of being so close, yet still helpless. This frustration can lead to poor decision making. Players become fixated on eliminating the Dart Goblin, committing more resources than his 3 elixir cost justifies, overextending in their eagerness to silence his assault. They make predictable moves, rushing troops forward without proper support, dropping spells impatiently without setting up maximum value. The Dart Goblin's range creates mental pressure that causes opponents to deviate from optimal play, and skilled players exploit these pressure-induced mistakes ruthlessly. The targeting priority decisions that range forces on opponents create interesting psychological dynamics. When the Dart Goblin is attacking, when those darts are steadily picking away at your troops or tower, you face uncomfortable choices. Do you address him immediately, potentially overcommitting resources? Do you ignore him and push the opposite lane, accepting his damage while trying to deal more in return? Do you try to tank his shots with high health troops while your damage dealers work elsewhere? None of these options feel fully satisfying, and the discomfort of choosing between imperfect options creates cognitive load that affects overall play quality. For the player using the Dart Goblin, the psychology is entirely different. There's a sense of safety, of being able to contribute without risking immediate retaliation. This safety allows for calmer decision-making, clearer tactical thinking unmuddied by the fear that characterizes frontline combat. You can observe the battlefield more comprehensively, can track multiple simultaneous threats, can make more measured decisions because you're not constantly in immediate danger. But this safety comes with its own psychological traps. The temptation to become passive, to simply sit back and fire without actively seeking better positions, can reduce effectiveness. The comfort of range can make players complacent, less vigilant about threats that can reach them, less prepared when opponents do successfully close distance. Optimal Dart Goblin play requires maintaining active engagement mentally, even while maintaining physical distance, remaining alert and adaptive rather than settling into passive comfort. The positioning decisions that range enables become exercises in spatial reasoning that engage different cognitive processes than melee combat. You're not thinking about being in the thick of action, about timing dodges, or managing immediate threats. You're thinking about sightlines, about angles of fire, about maintaining optimal distance from various threats while maximizing your own coverage. This requires visualization skills, the ability to mentally map the battlefield and predict how different positions will affect what you can attack and what can attack you. The psychological advantage of first strike cannot be overstated. The Dart Goblin's range means he's often attacking enemies before they can attack him, landing several hits before opponents close distance or reposition to threaten him. This first strike advantage creates momentum, puts opponents in reactive mode from the start of engagements, forces them to respond to damage already taken rather than proactively controlling engagement terms. The player controlling the Dart Goblin enjoys the psychological benefit of initiative, of being the actor rather than the reactor. Target selection psychology becomes interesting at range. The Dart Goblin can often choose between multiple potential targets, each with different threat levels and values. Do you focus fire on the low health troop you can eliminate quickly, removing a threat and creating an elixir advantage? Do you attack the higher health tank, slowly wearing it down even if you can't eliminate it before it reaches your defenses? Do you ignore deployed troops entirely and chip away at enemy towers, trading your attention for guaranteed damage? These decisions happen continuously, and making them well requires not just tactical understanding, but psychological discipline to resist tempting but suboptimal targets. The patience that effective range use requires tests many players psychologically. It's tempting to advance, to close distance, to get more involved in the action. But optimal Dart Goblin play often means staying back, maintaining distance, accepting that you'll be dealing damage more slowly than flashier troops, but more safely and sustainably. This patience must be cultivated, trained through experience, reinforced through observing the consequences of impatient overextension. Players who can't master this patience will never fully optimize the Dart Goblin's potential. The inverse psychological effect occurs in opponents who've been frustrated by Dart Goblins in previous matches. They enter new games with preloaded responses, predetermined to eliminate him immediately whenever he appears. This predictability is exploitable. Knowing opponents will likely spell or rush your Dart Goblin creates opportunities to bait these responses, to waste their resources on your Dart Goblin while setting up plays that capitalize on them having used their answers. The meta-psychology of expectation and manipulation adds layers to high-level play. Range creates information advantages that have psychological components. From his distant position, the Dart Goblin often has comprehensive view of the battlefield, can observe enemy deployments and patterns. The player controlling him gains information about opponents' deck composition, their tendencies, their likely responses to various situations. This information accumulation creates confidence, allows for increasingly accurate predictions of what opponents will do, enables pre-positioning and preparation that looks like precognition but is actually informed anticipation. The sustainability of ranged pressure creates psychological attrition. Unlike burst damage that happens once and ends, the Dart Goblin represents continuous, unending pressure if not addressed. This continuity wears on opponents mentally, creates a sense of being under siege, makes every second he remains active feel increasingly urgent. The longer he survives, the more damage accumulated, the more the psychological pressure builds until opponents feel forced to respond, often less optimally than they would if they could maintain calm detachment. The satisfaction of perfect positioning, of finding that ideal spot where you can attack everything important while remaining safe from everything dangerous, creates positive psychological feedback for the player controlling the Dart Goblin. This satisfaction reinforces good habits, makes players want to seek optimal positions rather than accepting convenient but suboptimal ones. The feeling of being perfectly placed, of having mastered the spatial puzzle the battlefield presents, is rewarding in ways that transcend mere mechanical effectiveness. Conversely, the frustration of poor positioning, of realizing you've left your Dart Goblin exposed or unable to effectively contribute, creates powerful negative feedback that promotes learning. The stark difference between optimal and suboptimal positions becomes obvious quickly through consequence, teaching through pain what analysis alone might not convey. Players learn to feel good positioning versus bad positioning kinesthetically, developing intuitive sense for where the Dart Goblin should be. The range disparity between the Dart Goblin and many of his targets creates a predator-prey dynamic psychologically. He's the hunter, patient, and methodical, picking off targets who cannot effectively fight back. This role reversal, where the small goblin becomes the predator and larger threats become prey, is psychologically satisfying for players who enjoy asymmetric combat, who find cleverness and positioning more interesting than straightforward tests of strength. For opponents, being prey is frustrating and can provoke emotional responses that degrade play quality. Anger at being unable to effectively retaliate stress from continuous damage accumulation, embarrassment at being dominated by a mere 3 elixir troop. All of these emotions can cloud judgment. Recognizing and managing these emotional responses separates emotionally mature players from those who tilt easily, who let frustration override strategy. The team color coordination of the Dart Goblin's mask decorations creates subtle psychological team identity reinforcement. Whether the rope and leaves are blue or red, they mark him as part of your team specifically, not just any generic unit. This visual connection strengthens the psychological bond between player and troop, makes victories feel more personal, defeats more meaningful. The aesthetic elements that seem purely cosmetic actually serve important psychological functions in creating investment and engagement. The sound design of the Dart Goblin contributes to the psychological experience significantly. The soft puff of air as darts launch, the subtle whistle as they fly, the small impact sounds when they hit, all create audio feedback that's satisfying without being overwhelming. This audio design makes using him pleasant sensorily, reinforces the fantasy of being a precise sniper, contributes to the overall experience in ways that pure visual feedback couldn't achieve alone. The learning curve psychology is particularly interesting with the Dart Goblin. He's straightforward enough that beginners can use him effectively immediately, can understand his basic function without extensive study. But the skill ceiling is high, with expert players extracting vastly more value through superior positioning and timing. This accessibility combined with depth creates healthy psychological progression, where players always feel like there's more to learn, more improvement possible, without ever feeling like the baseline competence is unattainable. The social proof psychology of the Dart Goblin's popularity cannot be ignored. Seeing professional players use him effectively, watching streams where he dominates, observing his high usage rates, all of this creates psychological validation for choosing to play him. He's not some weird niche pick that might work, but probably won't. He's mainstream, proven, accepted, which makes players more comfortable investing resources in upgrading him, more confident in including him in their decks. Ultimately, the psychology of range that the Dart Goblin represents is about control versus chaos. Range provides control, allows for measured, deliberate play even in chaotic circumstances. The 6.5 tiles of distance creates psychological space where clarity remains possible even when the battlefield descends into frantic action. For players who value this control, who find satisfaction in methodical precision over frantic improvisation, the Dart Goblin offers psychological fulfillment that extends beyond mere mechanical effectiveness into the realm of playstyle alignment with personal preference and temperament. Evolution's Call, the discovery of the poisonous mask. Now we come to a pivotal moment in the Dart Goblin's story. A transformation that would elevate him from master to legend, from expert to something approaching mythic. The discovery of the poisonous mask didn't happen through chance or luck. It was the culmination of years of searching, driven by whispers of ancient power and the same obsessive dedication that had defined his entire journey toward mastery. Close your eyes and imagine descending into darkness, into tunnels that wind beneath the earth, towards secrets that have waited centuries for someone worthy to uncover them. The story begins with fragments of legend, pieces of a puzzle that the Dart Goblin had been collecting for years without fully understanding what they meant or where they pointed. During his travels as a young warrior seeking to perfect his craft, he'd heard elders speak in hushed tones about goblin temples, places of ancient power hidden deep underground where artifacts of tremendous potency were kept. These weren't common knowledge, weren't locations marked on maps or discussed openly. They were secrets, carefully guarded by those few who remembered that such places existed. The temples were said to have been built by goblin ancestors who demastered arts that modern goblins barely understood, who'd worked with forces that went beyond mere physical craft into realms of magic and spiritual power. Within these temples, protected by wards and traps and the simple difficulty of finding them, artifacts waited. Masks that granted enhanced abilities, weapons imbued with properties beyond normal craftsmanship, potions that could transform those who drank them. All legendary, all difficult to verify, all relegated by most rational goblins to the category of entertaining myths rather than actionable truth. But the Dart Goblin had never been content dismissing possibilities just because they seemed unlikely. His voodoo mask, the one he wore daily, had itself been created through processes that bordered on the mythological. He'd experienced firsthand that the boundaries between natural and supernatural, between mundane and magical, were more porous than skeptics believed. If one powerful mask existed, achieved through goblin craft and spiritual technique, why couldn't others exist, created by ancestors who'd had centuries to refine their methods? He began investigating more systematically, treating the temple legends as a problem to be solved through careful research rather than fantastical stories to be enjoyed and dismissed. He sought out the oldest goblins he could find, those whose memories reached back further than most, whose knowledge included traditions that younger generations had forgotten. He listened to their stories carefully, separating obvious embellishment from potential factual cores, building a map not of physical locations, but of thematic patterns and repeated elements. Certain details appeared across multiple independent accounts. The temples were always described as underground, as if being beneath the earth was somehow essential to their nature or purpose. They were always protected, never simply open and accessible, requiring either specific knowledge to find or great determination to breach. They were always associated with particular powers or abilities, with stories of goblins who'd entered as ordinary warriors and emerged as something more. And they were always dangerous, with warnings about traps and guardians and the spiritual trials that anyone seeking their secrets would need to survive. The connection to the miner, that mysterious digger who tunneled through the earth with supernatural speed and precision, appeared in some accounts. Miners were said to sometimes stumble upon temple entrances during their excavations, though most lacked the knowledge or courage to actually enter what they'd found. A few stories spoke of miners who deliberately sought temple entrances, who'd used their earth-moving abilities to find what was hidden beneath layers of rock and soil, who traded information about temple locations to warriors seeking power. The Dart Goblin cultivated relationships with several miners, establishing reputation as someone who could be trusted, who paid fairly for information, who respected the risks that miners took in sharing knowledge that some within Goblin society considered dangerous or taboo. These relationships took years to build, required demonstrations of character and reliability, involved helping miners with tasks and favors that established reciprocal obligations. But eventually, trust grew sufficient that miners began sharing more closely held information. One miner in particular, an elderly specialist who'd spent decades tunneling through every variety of earth and stone, spoke of an encounter he'd had years ago. While excavating a new tunnel network, he'd broken through into a chamber that clearly wasn't natural. The walls were too smooth, too regular, bearing marks of tools and deliberate construction. In the chamber's center stood a door, carved with symbols he didn't recognize, sealed by mechanisms he didn't understand. The air in the chamber had felt different, charged with something that made his instincts scream danger. He'd sealed the chamber again, marked its location in his private records, and never returned. But he remembered. And now, in his old age, feeling his working years drawing to a close, he was willing to share what he'd found. The Dart Goblin listened with intense focus as the miner described the location, the depth, the distinctive geological markers that would allow the chamber to be found again. He offered payment, but the miner waved it away. Instead, he asked only that if the Dart Goblin found what he sought, if the temple proved real and beneficial. He remembered the old miner who'd made it possible. The Dart Goblin agreed solemnly, recognizing the gift he was being given. The expedition to find the chamber took weeks of preparation. He needed supplies for extended underground travel, equipment for navigating tunnels, tools for potential excavation if the original entrance had collapsed or shifted. He needed to arrange his arena obligations, ensuring his absence wouldn't leave his team understaffed. Most importantly, he needed to prepare mentally and spiritually, understanding that what he sought wasn't just physical treasure, but something that would test him at every level of his being. The descent into the earth began on a date he decalculated based on goblin spiritual calendars as particularly auspicious for undertaking transformative journeys. The miner had provided detailed directions, but following them in the dark, winding complexity of underground tunnel networks proved challenging despite the precision of the instructions. Days passed in near total darkness, navigating by feel and the dim light of his lamp, eating sparingly from his supplies, sleeping fitfully in cramped tunnel spaces. He found the chamber exactly where the miner had described it. The door stood before him, covered in symbols that he recognized from his spiritual studies as ancient goblin sacred writing, though the specific meanings of many symbols were lost to him. The door was wood, impossibly preserved, despite what must have been centuries underground, treated by processes that had protected it from rot and deterioration. He approached slowly, respectfully, aware that he was in the presence of something created by craftsmen who possessed knowledge and skill that made his own. Considerable abilities seemed modest in comparison. The door had no obvious lock, no handle or keyhole, but examination revealed pressure points, subtle indentations that corresponded to specific symbols carved into the wood. The puzzle was clear, if not simple. Press the right symbols in the right sequence, and the door would open. Press incorrectly, and he could only guess what defensive mechanisms might activate. He studied the symbols for hours, reviewing everything he'd learned about ancient goblin spiritual traditions, searching for patterns that would suggest a sequence. The breakthrough came when he stopped trying to read the symbols literally and instead felt for their spiritual resonance. His voodoo mask, worn throughout this journey, enhanced his perception in ways that normal senses couldn't achieve. He could sense which symbols carried stronger spiritual charges, which sequences created harmonious energy flows versus discordant ones. He began pressing symbols based not on intellectual analysis but on spiritual intuition, trusting the enhanced perception his mask provided. The door opened silently, swinging inward to reveal a tunnel that descended even deeper into the earth. The air that flowed out was cold and dry, carrying scents that spoke of incredible age, of spaces that had been sealed for longer than living memory. He stepped through the doorway, pausing on the threshold to offer a prayer to whatever goblin ancestors had created this place, asking permission to enter, declaring his intentions to seek knowledge and power in service of worthy goals rather than selfish corruption. The tunnel was carved with the same precision as the door, walls bearing additional symbols and pictographs that told stories he could only partially understand. He moved slowly, checking for traps, aware that places this sacred would certainly be protected. The first trap activated when he stepped on a particular floor stone, triggering a mechanism that shot darts across the passage where an incautious person's chest would be. He'd been careful, had been testing each step, and the trap triggered without harming him. He noted its position and continued. Additional traps revealed themselves as he progressed, each testing different aspects of awareness and skill. Pressure plates that triggered falling stones, tripwires that released poisonous gas if disturbed, concealed pits that would drop the unwary into darkness. The Dart Goblin navigated these dangers through a combination of caution, skill, and the enhanced perception his voodoo mask provided. What would have been lethal to most became merely challenging to someone prepared and spiritually attuned. The tunnel eventually opened into a larger chamber, clearly the heart of whatever temple complex this place represented. The space was circular, walls covered in elaborate murals depicting goblin warriors engaged in various activities, telling visual stories about the development of goblin combat arts and spiritual traditions. Torches set in wall sconces ignited spontaneously as he entered, magical flames that had waited in readiness for however many centuries the chamber had remained sealed. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal rested a mask. Even from across the chamber, the Dart Goblin could sense its power, could feel the spiritual energies radiating from it in waves that made his own mask hum in response. This mask was similar in overall design to his own, but distinctly different in specific details. Where his mask was carved with symbols of perception and precision, this one bore symbols of poison and decay. Where his mask's eyes glowed red with spiritual fire, this mask's eyes glowed a sickly green, the color of corruption and toxin. He approached slowly, reverently, aware that taking the mask would be the culmination of years of searching, but also the beginning of new responsibilities and challenges. Inscriptions on the pedestal, written in ancient goblin script that he could barely decipher with his mask's help, explained what the artifact was and what it offered. This was a mask of poisonous power, created by ancient goblin alchemists who'd mastered the transformation of natural toxins into spiritual weapons. A warrior who wore this mask would find their attacks imbued with poisonous properties, each strike delivering not just physical damage, but corruption that would continue damaging targets over time. But the inscriptions also warned of costs and requirements. The poison mask demanded absolute commitment, would not tolerate being set aside casually once bonded to a wearer. It would affect not just combat effectiveness, but the wearer's very nature, introducing elements of toxicity into their spiritual essence that could corrupt if not properly managed through discipline and continued spiritual practice. It was not for everyone, not for most goblins actually, intended only for those whose commitment to their path was total and whose spiritual foundations were strong enough to integrate poison without being consumed by it. The Dart Goblin stood before the pedestal for long minutes, considering whether he should take the mask. He'd searched for this kind of power, had dedicated enormous effort to finding it. But now, confronted with the reality of what accepting it would mean, he needed to be certain. Could he handle the responsibilities it would impose? Would the enhanced power be worth the costs in terms of changed nature and increased spiritual burden? Was this truly his path, or was he being tempted by power for its own sake rather than as a tool for serving worthy purposes? He thought about his journey, about everything he'd sacrificed and achieved in pursuit of mastery. He thought about the arena and the role he played there, defending allies and eliminating threats. He thought about the goblin traditions he represented, the craft he devoted his life to perfecting. And he realized that accepting the poison mask wasn't about gaining power. It was about taking the final step in a journey he'd been on his entire life, about achieving the fullest possible expression of what a blowgun specialist could become. He reached out and took the mask from the pedestal. The moment his fingers touched it, spiritual energy surged through him, not hostile, but testing, evaluating, determining whether he was truly worthy or whether he'd made a terrible mistake. His own voodoo mask amplified in response, creating a feedback loop of spiritual power that threatened to overwhelm him. He held firm, refusing to release either mask, enduring the trial of integration as the two artifacts established their relationship to each other and to him. When the surge finally subsided, he found himself changed. The poison mask hadn't replaced his voodoo mask, but rather complemented it, creating a dual mask configuration that enhanced both artifacts beyond what either could achieve alone. He could feel new capabilities awakening within him, understanding of toxins and corruption, ability to imbue his darts with properties that would make each strike vastly more effective than simple physical damage alone. The journey back to the surface was both easier and harder than the descent. Easier because he now knew the path, had already navigated the traps, could move more quickly through the underground passages. Harder because he was changing, integrating the poison mask's power into his being, experiencing transformations that were sometimes uncomfortable or disorienting. By the time he emerged into sunlight after weeks underground, he was recognizably himself, but also undeniably different, marked by the power he'd claimed in ways that anyone with spiritual sensitivity could perceive. The evolution was complete. The Dart Goblin had become the evolved Dart Goblin, his capabilities enhanced not through mere training, but through spiritual transformation enabled by ancient goblin magic. When he returned to the arena, when he deployed in his first battle wearing both masks and channeling their combined power, opponents discovered immediately that facing him had become vastly more dangerous than before. The Goblin Temple Mystery. Ancient secrets underground, the Goblin Temple that the Dart Goblin discovered wasn't unique, wasn't the only such place hidden beneath the earth. To understand the full significance of his find, we need to explore the broader mystery of the Goblin Temples, these sacred spaces that held the accumulated knowledge and power of goblin ancestors who achieved mastery of arts that modern goblins barely remembered. Let your mind drift through these ancient halls, imagining spaces carved from living rock where secrets waited in patient silence for those worthy to receive them. The creation of the temples dated back to a period in goblin history that had been largely forgotten by modern clans. A time when goblin society was more unified, more spiritually focused, more dedicated to preserving and advancing the accumulated wisdom of their people. This wasn't a golden age, necessarily. It wasn't some ideal paradise. But it was a period when goblins took seriously the responsibility of passing knowledge to future generations, of ensuring that hard-won understanding wouldn't be lost to time and chaos. The temple builders were a specialized caste within ancient goblin society, warriors, and craftsmen and spiritual practitioners who dedicated themselves to creating spaces that could preserve artifacts and knowledge across centuries or millennia. They studied geology to find the most stable locations deep underground where tectonic activity would undestroy what they built. They mastered preservation techniques that could protect organic materials like wood and cloth from the decay that normally claims everything. They developed defensive systems, traps, and wards that would protect their temples from looters while allowing legitimate seekers to access what was stored within. The reasons for building the temples underground, rather than on the surface, were both practical and spiritual. Practically, surface structures were vulnerable to warfare, weather, and the simple passage of time. Underground chambers, properly constructed in stable rock, could last indefinitely, protecting their contents from almost anything except the most determined excavation. Spiritually, the earth itself was considered sacred in goblin traditions, a source of strength and stability. Placing sacred objects beneath the earth's surface was seen as giving them to the earth's protection, creating a bond between artifact and elemental power that enhanced both. The number of temples created was unknown, their locations deliberately obscured through methods that ensured knowledge wouldn't be easily transmitted. Some ancient texts suggested dozens of temples scattered across the regions where goblin clans lived. Others hinted at hundreds, an entire network of sacred spaces linked by symbolic and spiritual connections, even though they had no physical passages connecting them. The truth was lost to time, with most temples likely undiscovered, their contents still waiting for seekers who might never come. The contents of each temple varied based on when it was created and what specific knowledge or artifacts its builders wished to preserve. Some temples functioned as armories, storing weapons created by master craftsmen whose techniques had been lost or forgotten. Other temples served as libraries of sorts, containing records carved in stone or preserved through magical means, documenting goblin history and techniques in detail that oral traditions couldn't match. Still other temples held artifacts of spiritual power, objects like the poison mask that transcended mere craftsmanship to become genuine sources of supernatural enhancement. The symbols carved throughout the temple served multiple purposes. They were decorative, displaying the artistic sensibilities of their creators. They were educational, telling stories and documenting techniques visually for those who understood how to read them. They were protective, forming wards and barriers that discouraged or prevented unauthorized access. And they were spiritual, creating resonance patterns that enhanced the power of artifacts stored within, making the temples themselves amplifiers and preservers of spiritual energy. The traps that protected the temples represented sophisticated understanding of both mechanical and spiritual defense. The mechanical traps tested physical skills, awareness, and caution, ensuring that only competent and careful individuals would reach the inner chambers. The spiritual traps tested worthiness in less tangible ways, creating challenges that evaluated character and intention. Barriers that would turn back those whose goals were selfish or corrupt, regardless of their technical ability to navigate physical dangers. The criteria for worthiness that the temples evaluated weren't explicitly documented anywhere, but patterns emerged from stories of various goblins who'd sought temple access over the years. Pure combat skill wasn't sufficient. Many technically proficient warriors failed spiritual trials that less skilled but more personally developed seekers passed. Selfish motivation inevitably led to failure. The temples somehow sensing when someone sought power for ego rather than service. Patience and respect were essential. Those who rushed or approached the temples casually finding that even simple traps became insurmountable obstacles. The specific temple that contained the poison mask had been built during a period when goblin alchemists had achieved remarkable understanding of toxins and their applications. The builders had been part of a tradition that viewed poison not as cowardly or evil, but as a legitimate tool, a force of nature that could be understood, controlled, and channeled toward worthy purposes. They'd created multiple poison-related artifacts, masks and weapons and potions, each designed to enhance a warrior's ability to deliver toxins effectively in combat. The mask the Dart Goblin found was apparently one of several similar items, each attuned to slightly different aspects of poisonous power. Some enhanced the potency of natural toxins the wearer might apply to weapons manually. Others granted the ability to generate spiritual poison, supernatural corruption that damaged not just bodies but souls. The mask the Dart Goblin claimed fell somewhere between these extremes, imbuing his attacks with poison that was partly physical and partly spiritual, affecting targets in both dimensions simultaneously. The murals in the temple chamber told stories about the mask's creation and previous wearers. The Dart Goblin had studied these murals carefully before leaving, understanding that they documented not just history, but also techniques and warnings that anyone bonding with the mask should know. The images showed ancient goblins in combat, their attacks leaving trails of toxic green energy, their enemies falling not just from wounds, but from the corruption spreading through their systems. Other murals depicted the spiritual practices required to maintain balance while using poisonous power. Meditation techniques that cleanse toxins from the user's own spiritual essence, preventing the poison they wielded from slowly corrupting them from within. Rituals that renewed the bond between mask and wearer while also establishing boundaries, ensuring the artifact enhanced rather than dominated. Exercises that developed the mental discipline needed to control poison precisely, delivering exactly as much toxicity as intended rather than losing control and causing indiscriminate harm. The warnings were equally clear and sobering. Images show goblins who'd failed to maintain proper spiritual discipline, becoming consumed by the very poison they'd sought to master. Their forms were twisted, corrupted, showing what happened when toxic power was wielded without proper understanding and respect. These cautionary depictions made clear that the poison mask wasn't simply a tool that anyone could use safely. It demanded ongoing work, continuous spiritual development, dedication to balance that had to be maintained for as long as the mask was worn. The temple itself held additional secrets beyond the mask. Side chambers contained other artifacts, some related to poison and others serving different purposes. The Dart Goblin explored these spaces carefully, documenting what he found, taking a few items that seemed potentially useful while leaving most in place, recognizing that he couldn't possibly use everything and that the temple should remain intact for future seekers who might need what it offered. One side chamber contained records, carved tablets that documented the history of the poison-wielding tradition within ancient goblin society. He spent hours studying these tablets, learning about practitioners who'd come before him, their achievements and their failures, the techniques they'd developed and the limitations they'd encountered. This historical knowledge proved invaluable, giving him context for understanding the power he'd claimed, showing him the tradition he was now part of and the responsibility he carried to honor and build upon what his ancestors had created. Another chamber held supplies for maintaining poison-related artifacts, compounds and materials that couldn't be easily obtained through normal means. He took samples, understanding that he might need these materials for the ongoing maintenance the mask required. The supplies had been preserved through the same methods that protected the mask itself, remaining potent despite the centuries they'd waited in storage, testament to the preservation skills of the temple builders. The exit from the temple revealed another layer of its mystery. The Dart Goblin noticed as he left that the entrance sealed behind him, mechanisms activating to close the door and camouflage the opening, making it appear as though nothing had ever disturbed the stone. The temple was protecting itself, ensuring that casual discovery wouldn't expose its contents to looters or the spiritually unprepared. He marked the location as best he could, but suspected that even with detailed directions, finding the entrance again would be extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. This self-protecting nature of the temples explained why they remained hidden despite the centuries since their creation. They didn't simply rely on physical concealment or the difficulty of underground navigation. They actively resisted discovery, using methods that blended mechanical, spiritual, and possibly even subtle magical properties to avoid detection. Only when conditions were right, when a worthy seeker with genuine need approached, would the temples allow themselves to be found. The network theory suggested that all goblin temples were somehow connected, that the spiritual energies they contained resonated with each other across whatever distances separated them physically. If this theory was true, and the Dart Goblin had found evidence suggesting it might be, then his discovery and claiming of the poison mask would have rippled through the network, announcing to any other temples that existed that a worthy seeker had successfully claimed power from one of their number. Perhaps this would make finding other temples easier for him in the future, recognition granted by the network itself that he'd proven his worthiness. The broader implications of the temple's existence raised profound questions about goblin history and the knowledge that had been lost over generations. What else might be preserved in undiscovered temples? What techniques and understanding had ancient goblins possessed that modern clans no longer even knew to seek? How many potential evolved forms might exist, waiting in the underground chambers for warriors dedicated enough to find them and prove themselves worthy of transformation? These questions had no certain answers, but they inspired the Dart Goblin and other seekers to continue searching, to pursue rumors and investigate legends that might lead to additional discoveries. Each new temple found, each artifact claimed, added pieces to the puzzle of what goblin society had once been and might become again. If enough of the ancient knowledge could be recovered and integrated into modern understanding. Now, as sleep draws closer, as these images of ancient temples and hidden power drift through your consciousness, let yourself appreciate the dedication required to seek these secrets. The Dart Goblin could have been satisfied with conventional mastery, could have remained simply excellent at his chosen craft. Instead, he pursued transformation, risked dangers both physical and spiritual, descended into darkness in search of light. That courage, that commitment to becoming more than he was, defines the difference between competence and legend. Toxic mastery, understanding the poison evolution, the transformation that occurred when the Dart Goblin claimed the poison mask fundamentally altered not just his combat effectiveness, but his entire relationship with his craft. The evolution wasn't merely an upgrade in statistics, though those improvements were significant. It represented a philosophical shift, a new understanding of what his darts could accomplish, a revelation that opened tactical possibilities he'd never previously imagined. Let's explore what the poison evolution means mechanically, spiritually, and strategically. understanding how toxicity became art in the hands of a master. The basic function of the evolved poison darts is elegantly simple. When a dart strikes a target, it delivers its normal physical damage, the sharp tip penetrating and causing immediate harm. But simultaneously, the poison infused into the dart through the mask's power begins its work, corrupting the target's system, dealing additional damage over time that continues even after the initial strike. This damage over time effect transforms each dart from a single moment of harm into an ongoing threat, pressure that builds with each successive hit. The poison damage accumulates. A target hit by one dart takes poison damage over several seconds. A target hit by multiple darts takes proportionally more damage as the toxins compound in their system. This accumulation means that the evolved Dart Goblin's effectiveness increases dramatically when he can maintain sustained fire on a single target, each dart adding to the damage of those before it, creating exponential growth in harm delivered per second of continued engagement. The visual feedback of the poison is distinctive and satisfying. Targets affected by the poison show visible corruption, greenish energy radiating from their wounds, indicating that they're suffering ongoing damage. This visual clarity serves important gameplay functions, allowing both the player using the evolved Dart Goblin and their opponents to track which targets are poisoned and how many stacks of poison they are carrying. But it also reinforces the fantasy, making the poison feel real and dangerous rather than just an abstract numerical modification. The strategic implications of poison damage ripple through every aspect of how the evolved Dart Goblin is deployed and utilized. Against single high-health targets like tanks or mini-tanks, the poison dramatically increases his effectiveness. Where the base Dart Goblin would chip away slowly through physical damage alone, the evolved version melts through health bars as poison accumulates. Tanks that would normally shrug off his darts find themselves unexpectedly vulnerable, corruption spreading faster than they can advance, sometimes dying before even reaching defensive positions. Against swarms, the poison's effect is somewhat different but equally valuable. Each small unit takes physical damage plus poison damage, and since swarm units typically have low health pools, the added damage often means they die in fewer hits than they would against base Dart Goblin. This allows the evolved version to clear swarms more quickly, reducing the time enemies spend attacking your defenses, minimizing the damage they deal before being eliminated. The efficiency gain might seem small per individual unit, but compounds significantly over the course of a full battle. The elixir trading dynamics shift with evolution. The base Dart Goblin at 3 elixir provided good value, able to trade favorably against many 4 or 5 elixir threats through proper positioning. The evolved version strengthens these trades, often securing positive trades against even more expensive threats. When your 3 elixir troop can eliminate or severely damage 6 or 7 elixir investments through sustained poison fire, the economic advantage becomes overwhelming over the course of a match. The tactical deployment patterns for evolved Dart Goblin maintain similarities to base deployment but with important modifications. He's still primarily a defensive troop, best used to counter enemy pushes rather than as a primary offensive threat. But the increased killing power from poison means he can be deployed more aggressively in certain situations positioned further forward than would be safe for base Dart Goblin because he can eliminate threats quickly enough that they don't have time to close distance and threaten him. The poison application through dart impact rather than requiring special activation or resource management makes the evolved Dart Goblin remarkably user-friendly. There's no complex mechanic to learn, no additional timing or positioning requirements beyond what effective base Dart Goblin usage already demands. You deploy him, he shoots darts. Those darts poison targets automatically. The complexity comes from leveraging this automatic poison optimally, rather than from mastering difficult mechanical execution. The spiritual dimension of wielding poison cannot be ignored. though it operates more in the realm of lore and character than gameplay mechanics. The Dart Goblin wearing the poison mask must maintain the spiritual discipline discussed in the temple murals, must practice the cleansing meditations that prevent the toxins he wields from corrupting his own essence. This ongoing spiritual work isn't represented mechanically in the game, but exists as part of his story, part of what makes the evolution more than just numerical improvements. The poison's nature sits somewhere between physical and supernatural. It damages the body through processes that resemble natural toxins, corrupting cellular function, disrupting vital systems. But it also carries spiritual components. Corruption that affects the target's life force in ways pure physical poison couldn't achieve. This hybrid nature makes the evolved Dart Goblin's poison effective against targets that might resist purely physical or purely magical attacks, threading a middle path that catches enemies without comprehensive defenses. The ethical considerations of using poison have long been debated in human warfare, with many cultures considering it dishonorable or cowardly. But goblin traditions, particularly the ancient ones preserved in the temples, viewed poison more practically. It's a tool, like any other, neither inherently honorable nor dishonorable. What matters is the purpose for which it's used and the character of those wielding it. The Dart Goblin using poison to defend his allies and eliminate threats to his team carries no moral stain, regardless of what human ethical traditions might suggest. The balanced considerations for the evolved Dart Goblin required careful attention from the development team. Evolution cards needed to feel significantly more powerful than their base versions to justify the resource investment required to unlock and upgrade them. But they also couldn't be so powerful that they became mandatory, that players without access to evolutions couldn't compete effectively. The poison evolution threads this needle successfully, providing meaningful power increase without breaking the game's fundamental balance. The community reception to the evolved Dart Goblin was generally positive, with players appreciating that the evolution maintained the core identity while adding new dimensions. He still played like a Dart Goblin, still required similar positioning and decision-making, still filled the same basic role in deck composition. The poison wasn't a gimmick that changed everything. It was an enhancement that made what he already did more effective, which felt natural and satisfying rather than jarring or confusing. The usage statistics for evolved Dart Goblin showed healthy but not excessive adoption. Not every player chose to evolve him, some preferring to invest evolution resources in other cards. But those who did evolve him reported satisfaction with the results, feeling that the evolution provided value commensurate with the investment required. This balance of adoption indicated good design, strong enough to be worth pursuing, but not so dominant that it became mandatory for competitive viability. The strategic synergies between evolved Dart Goblin and certain other cards created interesting deck-building possibilities. Cards that slowed enemies, keeping them in range longer, became more valuable when paired with poison that needed time to accumulate. Cards that distracted or tanked for the Dart Goblin gained increased value, since they enabled more sustained fire that maximized poison stacking. The evolution didn't exist in isolation, but as part of a broader tactical ecosystem that clever players could exploit. The poison's interaction with healing effects created counterplay dynamics that added strategic depth. Healing spells or troops that restored health could partially counter poison damage, extending target survival time, potentially allowing them to complete their objectives before dying. This created decision points for both players. Should the Dart Goblin user target the healer first to prevent them from countering poison, or focus on the primary threats? Should the opponent save healing for poison-afflicted troops or use it proactively before poison accumulates? These decisions added texture to matches. The visual evolution of the Dart Goblin himself reinforced the poison theme beautifully. The poison mask worn over his voodoo mask created a distinctive dual mask appearance that immediately communicated enhanced status. The green glow replacing or supplementing the red of his normal mask's eyes marked him as different, dangerous in new ways. The team-colored decorations remained, maintaining his identity while clearly signaling that this was an evolved form rather than a completely different troop. The skill ceiling for optimal evolved Dart Goblin usage rose slightly compared to base version. Players needed to understand damage timing, predicting when accumulated poison would finish off targets, allowing them to redirect fire to new threats earlier than they might otherwise think safe. They needed to prioritize targets differently, sometimes focusing the highest value threat even if other options were closer or easier to hit, trusting poison to finish low health targets while maximizing accumulation on tougher ones. The satisfaction of perfect poison plays, where careful target selection and sustained fire resulted in multiple enemies dying almost simultaneously, as accumulated corruption overwhelmed them, created memorable moments that players shared and celebrated. These highlights reinforced the appeal of playing evolved Dart Goblin, providing the kind of spectacular payoff that justified the effort required to achieve evolution and the skill needed to utilize it effectively. The lore implications of the evolution extend beyond just the individual Dart Goblin. His discovery of the poison mask and successful integration of its power demonstrated that ancient goblin knowledge remained relevant and accessible to those willing to seek it. This opened possibilities for other goblins, suggested paths they might pursue toward their own transformations. The temples held more than just the poison mask, and the evolved Dart Goblin's success would inspire others to undertake similar quests. The training required to maintain evolution differed from base training. The Dart Goblin had to practice with poisoned darts, learning how the added toxicity affected flight characteristics, how targets reacted differently to poison versus pure physical damage, how to pace his fire to maximize poison accumulation. This ongoing refinement kept even a master engaged, ensured that evolution wasn't an endpoint but another stage in continuous development. The relationship between the Dart Goblin and his masks deepened through evolution. The voodoo mask and poison mask weren't just equipment anymore. They were partners, extensions of self, spiritual allies in his ongoing journey. He communicated with them through meditation and ritual, maintained the bonds that kept their powers flowing properly, honored the traditions from which they'd emerged. This relationship elevated his practice from mere craft into something approaching sacred devotion. Now let the poison imagery drift through your relaxing mind, not as something frightening, but as a force that has been understood, controlled, channeled toward worthy purposes. The green glow, the accumulating corruption, the targets falling not to single devastating blows, but to the patient accumulation of toxic power applied with precision and dedication. This is mastery of a different sort mastery that embraces aspects others might fear that finds strength in sources. Others might avoid that proves expertise isn't about the tools you choose, but about how completely you understand and utilize whatever tools you wield. Strategic genius, deck building, and tactical applications. To fully appreciate the Dart Goblin, we must examine how he fits into the broader strategic landscape of Clash Royale, understanding not just what he does in isolation, but how he functions within carefully constructed decks, how he synergizes with other troops, how skilled players extract maximum value through positioning and timing that transforms a good card into a devastating one. Let your thoughts drift through these strategic considerations, understanding the chess-like complexity that underlies what might appear to be simple gameplay. The fundamental strategic value of the Dart Goblin lies in his efficiency. 3 elixir for 6.5 tile range and fast hit speed represents excellent cost-to-capability ratio, especially on defense, where his range allows him to attack enemies while remaining safe behind your own defensive line. This efficiency makes him valuable across virtually all deck archetypes, from aggressive cycle decks to patient control strategies to siege compositions that need reliable defensive support. In cycle decks, those strategies built around quickly rotating through your card rotation to repeatedly deploy your win condition. The Dart Goblin serves multiple crucial functions. His 3 elixir cost is low enough to enable quick cycling without being so cheap that he provides insufficient value. He contributes meaningfully on defense, justifying his inclusion beyond pure cycle speed. And he can apply offensive pressure as well, threatening chip damage on towers when opponents leave him unaddressed. Classic 2.6 Hog Cycle decks sometimes included Dart Goblin, leveraging these properties to create devastating pressure. The specific synergies with Hog Rider demonstrate cycle deck integration beautifully. Dart Goblin defends efficiently, then transitions into a counterpush by supporting the Hog with ranged fire. He clears defending swarms that would normally stop Hog Rider cold. He forces responses that might otherwise be safe for the Hog, creating elixir advantage or spell disadvantage for opponents. The combination isn't flashy, but it's brutally effective when piloted with skill and timing precision. Lock-bait strategies found the Dart Goblin to be natural inclusion. These decks aim to force opponents to use their log spell on targets like Goblin Gang or Princess, then capitalize with Goblin Barrel or other log-vulnerable threats. More ways to manipulate opponents' spell usage. More opportunities to catch them without the right answer at the right time. The bait synergy with Princess is particularly notable. Princess and Dart Goblin both provide long-range pressure that demands responses, but they die to different spells. Princess falls the log but survives zap. The tutorial value of the Dart Goblin for teaching new players about range, positioning, and target prioritization shouldn't be underestimated. New players who unlock and experiment with him learn fundamental strategic concepts through his mechanics. Understanding that range provides safety, that positioning determines effectiveness, that target selection affects outcomes, all of these lessons emerge naturally from using the Dart Goblin thoughtfully. He's educational without being patronizing, teaches while entertaining, provides depth for experts while remaining accessible to novices. The cosmetic options available for the Dart Goblin, though limited compared to some other troops, allow players to express their dedication and personalization. Tower skins, emotes, and other cosmetic elements let players show off their affection for this particular card. While these elements don't affect gameplay, they contribute to the sense that the Dart Goblin is more than just mechanical function, that he's a character worth celebrating and personalizing. The professional player testimonials about the Dart Goblin reveal respect that transcends his statistical power level. Pro players praise his reliability, his consistent performance, his versatility across matchups. They note that he's the kind of card you can always count on, that rarely feels like a dead draw, that contributes positively in most situations you might deploy him. This professional validation reinforces his position as genuinely good card, rather than just popular or fun, proving that expert analysis confirms what casual experience suggests. The balance history of the Dart Goblin shows restrained development philosophy. He's received adjustments over the years, small nerfs when slightly too strong, modest buffs when usage dropped too low. But he's never been dramatically overhauled, never fundamentally reimagined, never changed so much that players who mastered his usage had to completely relearn him. This consistency respects player investment, acknowledges that people have spent time mastering specific techniques, avoids invalidating that mastery through capricious redesigns. The cross-game presence of the Dart Goblin extends beyond Clash Royale. While primarily associated with the arena, elements of his design and concept appear in related Clash games, creating a sense that he's part of a broader universe rather than confined to one specific title. This cross-pollination enriches the entire Clash ecosystem, creates recognition and continuity across different games in the franchise, suggests that his impact extends beyond just one game's community. The social bonds formed around shared Dart Goblin appreciation create community cohesion. Players who main him, who build their primary strategies around his capabilities, form informal networks. They share replays, discuss strategies, theorize about optimal plays, celebrate achievements. These social connections, mediated through shared interest in one specific card, demonstrate how game elements can facilitate genuine human connection, create relationships that transcend the digital space where they originated. The inspirational aspect of the Dart Goblin's journey from concept to icon offers lessons beyond gaming. His story is about dedication, about mastering a craft through obsessive practice, about refusing to accept limitations, about finding your niche and becoming the absolute best at it. These themes resonate universally, applying to any field of endeavor, any pursuit of excellence. Players who connect with his narrative might find themselves inspired to pursue their own passions with similar dedication, to refuse to settle for mediocrity, to understand that mastery is possible for those willing to do the work. Looking toward the future, the Dart Goblin's continued relevance seems secure. Clash Royale will keep evolving. New cards will be introduced, balance will shift, but his fundamental utility ensures ongoing viability. Range will always matter. Sustained damage will always have value. Efficient defensive tools will always be needed. As long as these things remain true, the Dart Goblin will remain relevant, continuing to contribute to strategies, continuing to appear in competitive play, continuing to be valued by players at all skill levels. The potential for additional evolutions or variants creates exciting possibilities. What if future updates introduced alternate evolution paths, allowing players to choose between poison specialization and other options that enhance different aspects of his kit? What if special events granted temporary cosmetic or mechanical modifications that let players experiment with different Dart Goblin fantasies? The foundation is strong enough that creative expansions could add depth without compromising the core identity that makes him beloved. The legend of the Dart Goblin, in the end, is about the journey from novice to master, from ordinary goblin to arena icon. It's about patience, precision, dedication to craft. It is about proving that small warriors with simple tools can change the course of battles through perfect execution. It's about finding your place in a complex world, carving out a niche where your specific talents provide maximum value, becoming irreplaceable through mastery rather than might. And so we reach the end of our journey through the Dart Goblin's lore, having explored his origins, his training, his transformation, his impact. As your breathing slows, as sleep draws ever nearer, let these final thoughts drift gently through your consciousness, settling softly like dust after a long day's journey. The Dart Goblin stands at the back line, checking his equipment one final time. His blowgun is clean, properly maintained, ready for action. His darts are carefully arranged, each one inspected and found worthy. His masks, both the voodoo and the poison, rest comfortably on his face, their energies flowing through him in patterns he has grown so familiar with that he barely notices them consciously. He is ready. He is always ready. This is what mastery means. As you drift into sleep, perhaps you'll dream of distant targets and whispered projectiles, of patience rewarded and precision perfected. Perhaps you'll see yourself standing with the Dart Goblin, learning his craft, feeling the bamboo tube in your hands, experiencing the satisfaction of darts flying true across impossible distances. Perhaps you'll understand, in that space between waking and dreaming, what it means to commit fully to excellence, to refuse to accept anything less than your absolute best. The arena grows quiet as night deepens. Battles have paused, warriors rest. The eternal conflict enters one of its rare moments of peace. The Dart Goblin sits alone, cleaning his blowgun with careful attention, preparing for tomorrow's challenges while reflecting on today's accomplishments. He doesn't sleep much, this small green sniper. There's always something to practice, some technique to refine, some detail to perfect. This is his life, his choice, his joy. If you've enjoyed this deep exploration of Dart Goblin lore, This journey through the story of a master craftsman who became legend through dedication and skill. Consider leaving a like on this video. Subscribe to the channel for more comprehensive dives into Clash Royale character stories. For more explorations of the personalities and histories that make the arena come alive. Share your own Dart Goblin experiences in the comments, your favorite plays, your thoughts on his design, your appreciation for what he represents. Until next time, may your darts fly straight, your positioning be perfect, and your dedication to mastery never waver. Sleep well, dream deeply, and remember that excellence in any field comes not from natural talent alone, but from the willing choice to pursue improvement relentlessly, day after day, year after year, until what once seemed impossible becomes routine, and what once was routine becomes art. Good night, and good dreams.